Hello, and welcome to the Snoozy Scientist. Wherever you are tonight, whether you're winding down from a long day or searching for something soothing to fall asleep to, I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, we're traveling back to one of the most misunderstood ages in Earth's history, a time often remembered as calm and prosperous. 66 million years ago, the reign of the dinosaurs, rulers of sky, sea, and land, for more than 160 million years, came to a sudden fiery end. The asteroid that struck Earth that day didn't just end their world, it set the entire planet ablaze. Forests ignited within minutes, the oceans boiled at their edges, the air glowed red with heat and then black with ash. For years, sunlight vanished, hidden behind a veil of dust. Temperatures plunged, ecosystems collapsed, and nearly all of the great creatures of the Cretaceous vanished into silence. But that silence didn't last. From the soot and the ruin, something began to stir. The survivors, small, warm blooded mammals, clawed their way through ash choked soil. Birds, the last of the dinosaurs, clung to twisted branches. Crocodiles waded in the murky rivers of a dying world, patient as ever. And as the darkness began to lift, life tried to begin again. We often call what followed the Age of Mammals as if it were a peaceful recovery, a calm new beginning. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Volcanoes tore through continents, the air thickened with greenhouse heat, oceans turned to acid, forests drowned, and the climate swung violently between fire and ice. Evolution itself seemed to spiral, producing creatures stranger, sharper, and sometimes more terrifying than anything the dinosaurs had left behind. Some grew to monstrous sizes, only to vanish again. It was as if life was experimenting, testing new designs on a planet. Creatures stranger, sharper, and hungrier than anything before began to emerge. But how did the world that came after the dinosaurs become even more terrifying than theirs? What strange forms of life emerged in its chaos? And why was the so-called Age of Mammals one of the most violent and unpredictable chapters in Earth's entire history? Tonight, we'll wander together through that forgotten era, through jungles that grew at the poles, deserts born from ash, and seas where whales still had legs. We'll meet the monsters that rose after extinction and the quiet survivors that would one day give rise to us. But before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there? Your comments are one of my favorite parts of this sleepy little community, and if you're enjoying this space, it would mean so much if you tapped like or subscribed. For those already part of our quiet corner of science, thank you for making this journey possible. Now take a deep breath, let it go, and together, let's step into the age that came after the dinosaurs. When the firestorms faded and the last echoes of impact rolled away into silence, Earth entered a twilight that seemed endless. The sky, once blue and full of light, became a deep gray shroud that wrapped the planet from pole to pole. Dust, soot, and vaporized stone hung in the air so thick that the sun itself vanished. For years, daylight was little more than a dim copper haze that struggled to reach the ground. Across continents, the forests that once trembled with the steps of dinosaurs were gone. Charred stumps dotted the horizon where entire ecosystems had stood only days before. The air smelled of ash and iron. The rain that fell was not clear or cleansing, but heavy and sour, thick with acids formed in the poisoned sky. Oceans that had boiled at their edges now began to freeze at their surfaces. In this frozen dusk, life paused. The warmth of the sun, the pulse that had driven the rhythm of growth and decay, was gone. Without light, plants could no longer feed, and without plants, almost everything else began to follow. Photosynthesis faltered, then nearly stopped altogether. The food chains that had stretched across jungles, rivers, and oceans crumbled one link at a time, but extinction, even on a planet that seemed to have stopped breathing, was never absolute. Beneath the dead trees and collapsed canopies, a few small creatures stirred. They were not the giants that had once thundered across the plains or soared through humid skies. The world of scale and roar had ended. What survived were the quiet ones, the hidden ones, the small and warm-blooded. In burrows deep underground, mammals huddled together for warmth, their bodies trembling but alive. Their fur trapped what little heat they could make. Their hearts beat faster than those of the ancient reptiles that had once ruled above, giving them the spark they needed to endure the long chill. Birds, fragile descendants of the dinosaurs themselves, clung to branches stripped bare of leaves. Many did not survive, but those that did carried with them the lightness of air and the endurance of flight. They could travel, search, and scavenge in ways that heavier creatures never could. And in the rivers that had turned black with silt, crocodiles waited. They had outlasted catastrophe before, and they did again. Cold-blooded, patient, able to go weeks without feeding, they sank into the mud and let the slow heartbeat of the earth carry them through the dark. These survivors shared little at first glance, yet they carried the same essential strength, adaptability. They did not need much, and they could change quickly. In a world where everything else had broken, flexibility became the greatest weapon. As months turned to years, the skies began to shift. The dust slowly thinned, and the first pale hints of sunlight returned. The temperature rose by the smallest degree, but it was enough to melt the edges of the frozen seas. The oceans, long silent, began to move again. In the dim light, the planet looked utterly changed. The continents were barren, carved by floods and storms. Vast plains of ash stretched across regions that had once been rainforests. The silence was vast, but within it, something was beginning. Fungi spread first, feeding on the dead and recycling the carbon trapped in endless layers of decay. Their threads reached through soil and stone, weaving the first fragile webs of recovery. Then came the ferns, the ancient green pioneers of every devastated world. Their spores drifted on the weak winds, landing wherever moisture and warmth met. In their delicate leaves, the planet's first pulse of rebirth began. The small mammals emerged again into the open, blinking under a weak gray sun. They crept among the ruins, feeding on seeds, insects, and what little life had returned. Their tiny paws left the first footprints in the new world, each step carrying the memory of everything that had been lost. From this point on, life's clock began again, not from the top, but from the middle, as if time itself had skipped backward and forward, all at once. Ecosystems rebuilt themselves in miniature. Every creature that endured became both survivor and architect, carrying the genetic blueprints of the future. The age of dominance had passed. No longer would one kind of life tower over all others. The world that survived demanded balance, and those who adapted fastest would write the next chapter. The mammals, with their warmth, their curiosity, and their quiet endurance, began to explore niches left empty by the fallen giants. They climbed, dug, swam, and learned. Each generation carried within it a story of survival more intricate than the last. Birds diversified too, filling the skies with new colors and songs, their wings tracing paths through the light that had returned. And beneath it all, the crocodiles continued their watch, unchanged and eternal, a living reminder of the world before. The planet was fragile, still trembling from its wound, but life had found a foothold again. The silence began to fade. The winds carried the scent of green, and though no creature could have known it, the survivors of this shattered earth would go on to shape everything that followed, from the first forests that healed the land to the rise of beings who would one day look back and tell this story. The world that survived was smaller, quieter, and infinitely more determined. Out of the ashes of destruction, evolution found its second breath, and the long experiment of life began anew. For years, the world had known only shadow. The skies had stayed heavy with soot, the air thick with silence, and the ground cloaked in the chill of unending night. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the darkness began to thin. Light filtered through in faint, dusty strands, pale as morning, seen through fog. It was the first sunrise the planet had seen in what felt like eternity. The sun, once hidden behind a veil of ash and ruin, returned as a weak and weary glow. It did not blaze, it breathed. The light spread across continents of gray, falling upon plains where forests had once stood, and seas that still shimmered faintly with oil and debris. It found a planet changed, scarred and stripped bare, but still turning faithfully through space. Where the ash had fallen thickest, the ground now pulsed with quiet transformation. Moisture and decay, sunlight and stillness created the perfect conditions for something small and miraculous. Fungi, the great recyclers of life, began to bloom. Pale threads reached through soil and stone, weaving networks unseen, drawing nourishment from the bodies of the dead. They spread like ghostly maps beneath the surface, carrying the faint hum of renewal. Soon after came the ferns, their green fronds unfurling through the soot like flags of surrender and hope. In a world emptied of giants, their presence seemed delicate, almost impossible. Yet they covered the land swiftly, carpeting the hills and riverbanks with the first true green since the fires. Under their soft shade, the ground began to breathe again. Everywhere, traces of rebirth appeared in silence. Raindrops gathered on fern leaves, forming tiny mirrors that caught the light of the reborn sun. Streams that had been black with ash now ran clearer, washing away the last remains of a vanished age. The air was still bitter and strange, but it carried the faint scent of growth. And then, out of the hollows and tunnels, life began to stir once more. From burrows beneath the earth, the first mammals emerged. They were small, quick, and endlessly curious. Their eyes were wide and dark, adjusted to years of dimness, their whiskers twitching as they explored the fragile new world. They scavenged what they could find: seeds, roots, insects, anything that promised survival. Each step they took left tiny imprints on the soft, renewed soil, footprints marking the beginning of a different era. These were not the heirs of the dinosaurs' power, but of their endurance. They carried warmth within them, a flickering fire that the cold of extinction had not snuffed out. Their hearts beat fast, their minds quickened by necessity, their bodies built to adapt. In their smallness, they had found protection. In their intelligence, they had found a way forward. Above them, the air was filled with the rustle of wings. Birds, the last link to the old world, returned to the open sky. They perched upon charred trunks and rocky ledges, calling to one another in sharp, haunting tones. Many of their kind had vanished, but those that remained carried the memory of flight through the age of ruin. Their feathers caught the newborn light, scattering it like flakes of gold against the gray. In the shallows of rivers, amphibians croaked their first songs of the new age. In the swamps, insects buzzed and glittered. The quiet world began to fill with sound again, cautious, uncertain, but real. The earth, once silenced by catastrophe, had found its voice once more. But beneath this fragile calm, the planet still trembled. The wounds of impact ran deep through its crust. Volcanoes stirred in distant lands, and the air still held traces of poison. Temperatures swung between heat and chill as the climate struggled to find balance. The ferns that thrived today could wither tomorrow. The rivers that ran clear could flood with ash again. Even so, Life pressed forward. It had always done so. The survivors had no memory of the age before them. They did not know the roar of the tyrannosaurs or the shadows of flying reptiles that once crossed the sun. What they knew was simpler and far more important: how to live in the moment they were given. The mammals nested together for warmth and safety. They learned to hunt insects beneath stones, to hide from predators that crept through the night, and to listen to the faint rumblings of a planet still restless beneath their feet. Every sense sharpened, every heartbeat was a lesson written into flesh. As centuries passed, the green spread wider, forests began to rise again, young and thin at first, then taller and bolder, roots anchored into ancient ash, drawing strength from what had perished. The air warmed just enough to fill with mist and the hum of returning life. The sky grew blue once more, fragile but familiar, and in this slow rebirth, the world found beauty again. Not the grandeur of the old, but a quieter, more enduring kind. It was the beauty of persistence, of tiny lives rebuilding an entire planet grain by grain. The first dawn after darkness was not bright or loud. It was tender, it was patient. It was the breath of a world learning to live again after the fire. The giants were gone, their echoes fading into stone, but their end had opened space for something new, a quieter strength, a softer kind of survival. In the trembling light of that first sunrise, life began, not with thunder, but with a whisper. The calm that followed the darkness was fragile. It rested over the planet like a thin layer of mist, soft and temporary, easily broken by the restless heart of the world beneath. For a brief span in deep time, Earth seemed to breathe again. The light had returned, the forests had begun to heal, and the survivors of extinction had found their rhythm. Yet below the crust, far beneath the roots of the new forests, pressure was building once more. In what is now India, the ground began to tremble. Fissures cracked open in the surface, releasing plumes of fire and smoke that reached the stratosphere. The Deccan traps had awakened, a landscape of molten fury that would not rest for centuries. Lava poured from vast fractures, not as single eruptions, but as waves of molten stone spreading for thousands of kilometers. Each outpouring left behind layers upon layers of basalt, still visible today like the pages of a burned and ancient book. The skies darkened again, though this time not from a sudden impact, but from the slow exhalation of the planet itself. Ash rose high into the atmosphere, mingling with gases that changed the air's very chemistry. Carbon dioxide thickened around the earth like a suffocating blanket, trapping heat that had nowhere to escape. At first, temperatures began to rise. Rainforests stretched wider, humid and strange. The air grew heavy, and the oceans warmed until they shimmered like vast mirrors of steam. But the same gases that fed the warmth also poisoned the balance. Sulfur, chlorine, and carbon mingled in the air, shifting the climate's rhythm in wild, unpredictable swings. Within mere millennia, the blink of an eye in Earth's measure of time, the planet swung from furnace heat to deep chill and then back again. It was an Earth that could not decide what it wanted to be. One century might drown in tropical heat, the next might freeze beneath a shroud of ice. Seasons lost their patterns, winds carried storms across entire continents, and life had to learn to change faster than ever before. The oceans, which had sheltered so much of the planet's resilience, began to suffer quietly. As volcanic gases dissolved into the water, they turned it acidic, stripping away the delicate shells of plankton and corals. Reefs that had begun to regrow after the great extinction once again withered. In the shallows, fish and mollusks fled from dead zones where oxygen was scarce. In deeper waters, currents shifted unpredictably, carrying nutrients to strange new places while starving others. On land, forests rose and fell with the climate's moods. Some regions became lush and overgrown, tangled with ferns, palms, and towering trees. Others turned to wastelands of dust and salt where little could survive. Rivers dried up, then flooded again, carving new valleys in the soft volcanic rock. Mountains of basalt cooled in the open air, forming black staircases that stretched toward the horizon, frozen waves of molten time. And yet, in the middle of this chaos, life continued. Mammals grew bolder, their bodies adjusting to the new extremes. Some took to the trees, learning to climb and glide through the unstable forests. Others stayed close to the ground, burrowing deep when the air grew too hot or cold. Each generation carried tiny adjustments, small victories written quietly into bone and blood. Birds filled the changing skies with motion, their wings tracing lines across clouds stained red with volcanic haze. They were wanderers now, following warmth when the cold returned, and fleeing storms when the air grew heavy with sulfur. The world no longer offered certainty, only constant motion. Even the plants began to evolve in response to the planet's indecision. Some grew thick, waxy leaves to preserve water during the long dry seasons. Others developed roots that reached deeper, anchoring themselves to survive the floods that followed. Evolution had no single direction anymore, only reaction, life sculpting itself against the unpredictable breath of the earth. For millions of years, this turmoil continued. The Deccan eruptions did not fade quickly. Instead, they came in pulses, each one shifting the atmosphere and rewriting the rules for survival. The air was sometimes too thick to breathe, sometimes too thin to trap warmth. The planet's heartbeat grew erratic, and even the sun seemed distant behind the shifting veils of dust. Yet through every upheaval, something remarkable persisted. The descendants of the survivors learned to live not by waiting for stability, but by embracing change itself. To exist on such a planet was to become a creature of adaptation, small, alert, and endlessly inventive. Slowly, very slowly, the eruptions quieted, the fires dimmed, and the skies began to clear once more. But the damage had been done. The oceans were different now. The air carried a new mix of gases, and the land had reshaped itself entirely. The world that emerged was nothing like the one that had burned, nor the one that had frozen. It was a planet remade, alive but restless, forever remembering the time when it had lost control. The calm that followed would not last long, but for a while, Earth exhaled. The winds softened, the seas shimmered beneath a pale sky, and once again, fragile green began to creep across the blackened stone, a quiet reminder that even after the planet's most violent moods, life would always find a way to begin again. The earth was quieter now. The great fires had faded, the sky had cleared, and green once again cloaked the continents. Rivers moved softly through the valleys carved by ancient lava, and the forests, though young, whispered with new life. Yet beneath this calm, something subtle was happening. The survivors of the Dark Ages, small, warm-blooded, quick-thinking mammals, were beginning to change. For millions of years they had lived in the shadows, feeding on insects, hiding from larger reptiles, and burrowing deep whenever the world above grew unstable. But now, the land was open, the giants of the past were gone, and the air no longer trembled with the footsteps of dinosaurs. In this rare moment of emptiness, evolution began to accelerate. Nature, like an artist with a blank canvas, started to experiment. The mammals that once looked almost identical began to drift in different directions. Some stretched longer limbs and learned to run. Others grew keener noses to sense prey through dense undergrowth. A few began to climb, developing grasping fingers and curious eyes that watched the forests from above. Their skulls changed first. Tiny jaws that once cracked beetles and worms grew stronger, sharper, more specialized. New kinds of teeth appeared, some shaped for slicing, others for grinding. The arrangement of these teeth, small as they were, marked the beginnings of predators, unlike anything Earth had known before. The forests of the Paleocene and early Eocene were alive with movement. In the leaf litter, sleek creatures darted between shadows, hunting insects, frogs, and other mammals. Their bodies were built for agility, their spines flexible, their senses alert to every rustle. They were no longer simply surviving, they were testing the limits of speed, cunning, and strength. Fossils found in these ancient layers tell stories written in bone, the shapes of their skulls, the ridges of their jaws, the placement of their eyes. Each detail reveals how quickly intelligence was taking root. Some species developed forward facing vision, giving them depth perception for hunting. Others expanded the regions of their brains that controlled smell and coordination. They were learning to predict movement, to plan, to stalk. In this new world, every advantage mattered. Small changes meant survival, and survival meant the chance to shape the future. The warm-blooded nature of mammals gave them energy to move through cold nights, when reptiles still slept in the chill. Their fur insulated them from the wild swings of climate. Their hearts beat faster, their minds stayed awake longer, and their young were nurtured in ways that gave them a head start from birth. From these humble origins, entire lineages began to branch out. Some remained tiny and elusive, perfecting stealth rather than strength. Others grew larger, their bones thickening, their muscles tightening beneath fur that shimmered in the filtered sunlight. Predation was no longer a desperate act of scavenging, but a craft, one refined through instinct and time. In ancient wetlands, the ancestors of carnivorous mammals hunted along the muddy banks. They left faint footprints that hardened into stone, traces of soft paws that carried future kings of the animal world. The air here was humid and heavy with scent. Every step stirred dragonflies. Every splash sent ripples through the still water. In the silence between calls of birds, the early hunters learned to listen, to wait. Over the eons, their forms diversified. Some became long-bodied and slender, adapted for weaving through the undergrowth. Others grew compact and powerful, their jaws designed for crushing bone. A few, drawn to the water, developed strong limbs and tails that helped them swim. They hunted fish and amphibians, moving between land and river with a grace that hinted at what whales would one day become. The world itself was encouraging their rise. The forests were dense and full of cover, the nights cool and long. Every environment offered a different challenge, and life responded with creativity. In this slow, patient revolution, predators were not built in haste but sculpted carefully over millions of years. The smallest among them were often the most successful. They could slip through branches, vanish into holes, and strike swiftly before fading again into the green. They had no armor, no claws of metal or teeth like knives, yet their intelligence gave them balance. They learned patterns, when to hide, when to chase, when to rest. In their quiet calculations, the roots of future hunters were growing. From their lineage would one day come the great cats, the wolves, the bears, and the whales that ruled the seas. But at this time, they were still experiments of evolution, ideas being tested in fur and flesh. If one could have walked through those forests, one might have seen them only as flickers of motion, flashes of fur beneath ferns, eyes gleaming in half-light. The true power of their kind was not yet size, but potential, and in that potential, life had found something new, a way of hunting that depended not just on strength, but on thought. As the forests deepened and rivers wound through valleys of cooling stone, the hidden predators moved quietly through the undergrowth, shaping the destiny of the mammal age. Each small leap, each silent chase, each successful hunt added another thread to the vast web of evolution. The world had lost its giants, but it had gained something far more intricate. In the shadows of this restless planet, Intelligence was beginning to hunt. The world had warmed again. After ages of fire, ash, and frost, the planet finally exhaled a long, humid breath. The skies softened, clouds thickened, and rain fell often and generously. Rivers overflowed into valleys, swamps spread across continents, and life, as if awakened from a long sleep, grew wild and endless. It was the Eocene, and Earth had become a greenhouse. The air carried the scent of wet leaves and flowering vines. Forests covered nearly every corner of the planet, wrapping even the poles in green. Where ice had once gripped the land, palms now stretched toward the sun. Giant ferns unfolded in the warm light, and redwoods taller than cathedrals climbed toward skies heavy with mist. If one could drift above this world, it would seem like a single, living organism, a vast sea of trees, breathing in rhythm with the wind. From the equator to the farthest north, jungles reached unbroken across continents, stitched together by rivers that shimmered in the haze. There were no cold places anymore. Even what is now Alaska and northern Europe lay beneath canopies so thick that sunlight dappled the forest floor like gold scattered through shadow. The warmth was constant. Days were heavy and still, nights alive with the quiet hum of insects and the distant calls of creatures hidden in the dark. The air itself seemed alive, thick with pollen and moisture, wrapping everything in the slow pulse of growth. In these forests, life had become an experiment in form and color. Mammals, once small and cautious, now climbed, glided, and leapt among the branches. Limbs grew longer, tails more flexible, eyes wider and brighter to see through the shifting greens. Some fed on fruits and soft leaves, others hunted in silence through the underbrush. Tiny primates with nimble fingers moved through the canopy in endless search of food. Their world was three-dimensional, an ocean of leaves where danger could come from above or below. They learned to balance, to leap, to communicate through soft chirps and calls that echoed through the trees. Beneath them, on the forest floor, hoofed mammals wandered in herds, stepping carefully among roots and fallen logs. Their ancestors had once run in open plains, but now they adapted to a life of shadow and mud. Everywhere, the world shimmered with life. Turtles and crocodiles basked in flooded swamps. Giant birds stalked the shallows, their beaks glinting in the filtered sunlight. Snakes the length of small boats coiled through the ferns, their scales blending perfectly with moss and bark. Insects as large as hands moved through the air like living jewels, feeding on flowers that bloomed year-round. It was a time of abundance, of color, of motion, but beneath this beauty, the planet was restless. The warmth that fed the forests came from deep within the Earth's own breath, carbon thick in the air, trapping sunlight, turning the atmosphere into a slow, sweltering blanket. The oceans, too, had grown warm and shallow, their surfaces glistening under the heavy sky. Coral reefs expanded, strange fish gliding among their towers of living stone. Yet the balance was delicate, and it trembled under its own weight. Rain fell endlessly in some regions, carving deep channels through the forests, while others dried beneath sudden droughts. Volcanoes still smoked in distant lands, adding their fumes to the air. The temperature never stopped rising. It crept upward year after year, unnoticeable in a lifetime, but unstoppable across centuries. Still, life continued to flourish. It had learned to bend rather than break. Trees grew broader leaves to shed heat and capture more light. Mammals grew smaller again, their bodies better suited to the heavy air. Even the oceans filled with new kinds of creatures, the early ancestors of whales that still carried traces of the land in their bones. To walk through this world would have felt dreamlike. The air was golden, the ground soft with fallen leaves, and everywhere the whisper of movement. The forests pulsed with color, yet there was an unease to their beauty. Beneath the dense canopy, light rarely touched the soil. The trunks of trees rose like pillars into shadow, and the air below was cool and dim, thick with the scent of earth and decay. In the dark places between the roots, predators waited. Their eyes glowed faintly, catching the dim light as they moved through the undergrowth. The world above might have seemed peaceful, but below it was a constant dance of hunger and survival. Every sound mattered: the crack of a twig, the rustle of a fern, the distant flutter of wings. Even as the planet thrived, it was changing in ways no creature could sense. The gases that fed its warmth were building beyond balance. The seas would one day grow too acidic, the forests too hot to endure. But for now, the illusion of paradise held. The earth was a vast greenhouse, pulsing with life and danger in equal measure. In this age, everything breathed faster: the forests, the oceans, even time itself. Evolution moved swiftly, shaping creatures that would define the epochs to come. The jungles stretched endlessly, green and golden and full of secrets. It was a world at peace, at least on the surface. Beneath, the heartbeat of the planet grew louder, slow and steady, waiting for its next change. The warmth that had blanketed the world for millions of years began to deepen, slow and steady at first, then sudden and fierce. It was a change that crept through the air and the oceans alike, an invisible fever spreading through the planet's veins. The balance that had allowed the forest to flourish and the creatures to thrive began to tilt. The Earth was entering one of the strangest and most perilous moments in its history, a time when heat itself became the enemy. It began with a small spark, though no one can say where exactly it was lit. Deep beneath the seafloor, frozen methane stirred from its icy sleep, bubbling into the water and rising through the waves. In other places, volcanoes may have erupted for centuries, their vents exhaling vast clouds of carbon into the air. Whatever the source, the effect was the same. Greenhouse gases flooded the atmosphere, trapping sunlight, thickening the air with warmth that would not leave. Within only a few thousand years, a heartbeat in the rhythm of geological time, global temperatures climbed by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. The change was swift, far faster than the slow pace to which life was accustomed. The seas grew hot and restless, the air heavy and strange. Rain fell in torrents one year, vanished entirely the next. Rivers changed course, and forests began to wilt at their roots. The oceans, which had always served as the planet's great stabilizers, began to turn against life. As carbon filled the air, it dissolved into the water, forming acid that ate away at the shells of plankton and corals. Whole marine ecosystems trembled and collapsed. The clear blue shallows where life had flourished became murky and sour, and the creatures that depended on them began to vanish. The great chains of oceanic life, from the smallest drifting organisms to the largest whales, weakened link by link. On land, the heat reshaped everything. The lush forests of the Eocene began to thin as droughts spread. Trees dropped, their leaves to survive the relentless sun, leaving open ground that baked and cracked. Fires raged more often, their smoke filling the skies with a hazy veil. The once green earth took on the color of dust and flame. For the animals that had thrived in the warmth, the change was too much, too fast. Many could not adapt. Entire lineages disappeared without leaving a trace. Those that survived were forced to move. Mammals and birds fled north and south, seeking the cooler edges of the planet. The poles, once temperate and green, became crowded refuges for the displaced. Fossils found in what is now the Arctic reveal forests filled with tropical species, palms, ferns, and mammals that should never have been so far from the equator. Even in those high latitudes, the nights stayed warm. The world's rhythm of day and night, heat and cool, had lost its balance. Earth was wrapped in a fever that would not break. Deep in the oceans, another danger brewed. As temperatures climbed, the pliable tintran, remaining methane trapped in frozen layers beneath the seabed, began to melt. It escaped in great plumes, adding more heat to the air in a runaway spiral. The more the planet warmed, the more methane escaped, and the more the planet warmed still. It was a feedback loop that nearly tipped the world into catastrophe. Life, for all its resilience, was pushed to its edge. Some creatures adapted by shrinking in size, needing less energy to survive. Others developed new strategies, shorter lifespans, faster reproduction, behaviors born of necessity. Evolution accelerated once more, sculpted by stress and heat. Yet many of the great forms of life that had ruled the forests and seas simply disappeared. The cause of this ancient event, known today as the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, remains uncertain. Some scientists point to volcanic eruptions that released immense quantities of carbon from the Earth's crust. Others believe the warming oceans unleashed stores of methane from beneath the seafloor. Perhaps both were true, working together in a chain of reactions that the planet could not stop. What is known is that for nearly 200,000 years, the Earth remained trapped in its fever. The poles were ice-free, the seas rose high, storms swept across continents with a violence unknown before. The world became, for a time, a greenhouse adrift in its own heat. And then, as mysteriously as it had begun, the fever broke. The planet cooled, slowly, unevenly, as if recovering from an illness. Carbon was drawn back into the rocks and the oceans, locked away once more. The air cleared, the forests grew thicker again, the survivors spread and changed, filling the empty spaces left behind. But the memory of that heat never faded. It was written into the layers of sediment, into the chemical fingerprints of ancient shells, into the bones of the creatures that endured. The Earth had shown how quickly its calm could be lost, how fragile the balance of its warmth truly was. In the silence that followed, the planet turned onward, carrying the scars of a time when it had almost lost control once more, not to fire from the sky, but to the heat rising quietly from within itself. After the great fever of the planet cooled, and the forests returned to quiet green, life once again began to fill the open spaces left behind. Mammals, though still small and cautious, had spread across continents, testing the edges of what the new Earth would allow. The skies were alive with birds of every color and call, their ancestors having survived the darkness that ended the age of giants. They were the descendants of the last dinosaurs, their bloodlines carried through delicate feathers and hollow bones. But in one corner of the world, far to the south, some of these birds chose not to fly. In ancient South America, long isolated from the rest of the continents, evolution was free to experiment in strange and daring ways. Forests met endless grasslands, rivers wound through fertile plains rich with prey. There were no great land predators here, no lions, no saber-tooths, no wolves. The mammals that lived in this world were herbivores, gentle grazers and foragers. It was a fixed paradise without hunters. And into that empty role stepped the birds. They grew large, far larger than their flying kin. Over generations, wings became smaller, their feathers coarser and heavier. Strong legs took over, long and muscled, built for running rather than flight. Their bodies balanced perfectly on two limbs, their posture upright, their movements swift. By the time these creatures reached their peak, they stood over 3 meters tall, their eyes level with the heads of the tallest mammals. Their beaks curved downward like polished blades, thick and sharp enough to crack bone. They are known today as the terror birds. The name fits, though there is also something elegant in their design. Their beaks were not crude weapons. They were precision tools, capable of striking with speed and accuracy. Each blow could crush skulls, pierce flesh, and kill with shocking efficiency. When they ran, their steps thudded against the soil in a rhythm that carried both power and grace. Fossils show claws worn smooth from sprinting, as if these birds had spent their entire lives chasing down prey across open fields. Paleontologists have found skulls of mammals from that time with neat, round punctures, perfect fits for the curved tips of terror bird beaks. Their victims were struck once, sometimes twice, in vital places. These were not clumsy hunters. They were deliberate, calculated, almost surgical. The irony is haunting. The last of the dinosaurs, who once ruled every corner of the planet, had vanished into extinction. Yet here, their descendants reclaimed the crown in a new form: feathers instead of scales, silence instead of thunder, but the same ancient hunger that had driven their ancestors across the ages. The land around them was unlike the thick jungles of the north. South America at the time was warm and open, filled with golden grass and scattered trees. Herds of early hoofed mammals grazed along the plains, small compared to what would come later. Rodents, marsupials, and armadillo-like creatures scurried in the underbrush. It was a world of constant motion, every creature alert, every sound a potential signal of danger. And through this landscape, the terror birds moved like shadows. Some species, like Phorusrhacos, had narrow skulls and long legs, built for speed. Others, like Kelenken, were heavier, their skulls as long as a human arm, their strikes strong enough to shatter bone. The largest could sprint faster than a horse, using their speed to chase down prey before delivering a single, devastating blow. When they fed, their beaks tore through meat with the precision of a blade. They swallowed in great gulps, their throats expanding with the motion. For smaller creatures, escape was nearly impossible. Even a brief flash of feathers in the tall grass could mean the end. And yet, these birds were not monsters in the way legends would imagine them. They were products of their time, evolution's answer to an empty niche. When the mammals failed to produce large predators, nature turned instead to the sky's survivors. The same wings that once lifted their ancestors above danger became useless in this new pursuit. Strength flowed into their legs, sharpness into their gaze. The hunters of the air had become the hunters of the earth. The fossils of their nests tell quieter stories. They guarded their eggs carefully, building shallow scrapes lined with leaves and soft plant matter. Chicks hatched covered in down, small copies of their towering parents, already swift and alert. Life continued even among predators, the cycle of care and hunger intertwined. For millions of years, the terror birds ruled their isolated continent. Their reign lasted far longer than most apex predators that followed, but isolation could not last forever. In time, shifting continents would bring new waves of competition: cats, bears, and wolves crossing from the north. The balance would tilt once again, but for that long golden age, South America belonged to them. Across the grasslands, in the still heat of noon, the shadow of a running bird would stretch over the herds, silent and swift. A moment later, the quiet would break, and the chase would begin, a rhythm older than humanity, older even than the forests themselves. The age of monsters had never truly ended. It had simply changed shape. Feathers had replaced scales, wings had folded into arms, but the same ancient hunger still echoed across the earth. And in the warm winds of the southern plains, that echo was carried on the beat of running feet. The earth had calmed again. The wild heat of the great thermal spike faded slowly, and the world settled into a long, steady rhythm of warmth and rain. Forests once more spread across continents, filling valleys, hills, and low plains with deep green. Rivers braided through soft soil, carrying life wherever they touched. The land had healed, and in its peace, life began to dream of size once again. It started quietly. Small herbivores wandered the edges of swamps, nibbling on ferns and low leaves. Their bodies grew heavier with every generation, their bones thicker, their steps slower. In a world filled with food and little threat, there was no need to hide. The forests offered safety, and the air was rich with oxygen. Every creature that survived long enough to eat and rest found itself growing larger with time. Evolution, it seems, never forgets the shape of giants. Soon, across the Eocene plains and forests, the land began to echo with the sound of enormous feet. Great herds of mammals replaced the herds of dinosaurs that had once ruled millions of years before. The scale was familiar, but the forms were new. These were not reptiles covered in scales and bone, but mammals draped in skin and fur, their faces heavy with expression, their movements slow and deliberate. Among the first of these new giants was Coryphodon, a creature that looked part hippo, part bear, and part dream. It stood as tall as a person and weighed as much as a small car. It lived in the swamps and rivers of North America and Europe, feeding on soft plants that grew along the water's edge. Its teeth were broad and ridged, perfect for grinding reeds and ferns. With small tusks and short legs, it moved clumsily through the mud, but its size gave it confidence. Few predators would dare approach it. Then came Uintatherium, heavier and stranger still. Its skull was thick and knobby, crowned with bony protrusions like half-formed horns. Its long, curved tusks jutted from its upper jaw, gleaming when it lifted its head to graze on the leaves of low trees. It could weigh more than 2 tons and stretch nearly the length of a small car. Fossils show that its skull alone could reach over a meter long, a fortress of bone that protected its small, intelligent eyes. When it walked, the earth must have trembled slightly beneath its feet. Farther west, in the wide open plains that would one day form the Rocky Mountains, another kind of giant evolved. Brontotherium, the thunder beast, was the largest of them all. It stood twice the height of a man, with a massive body supported by sturdy legs and a head crowned with a great forked horn. These horns, made of solid bone, curved upward like twin crescents. They were not weapons for hunting, but for display and defense, perhaps used in slow, rumbling battles for mates or territory. Fossilized footprints suggest that Brontotherium moved in herds. Imagine the sound, the rhythmic thunder of dozens of heavy bodies crossing a grassy plain, the ground vibrating under each step. These creatures were peaceful wanderers, grazing on leaves, ferns, and soft vegetation, their lives dictated by the movement of water and seasons. The return of such immense creatures was more than coincidence. It was a pattern written into the logic of life. Whenever ecosystems become rich and stable, and when food and oxygen are plentiful, size becomes an advantage. Large bodies lose heat more slowly, fend off predators more easily, and move long distances in search of resources. Giants emerge wherever life is allowed to thrive without interruption. But size also carries a quiet cost. It demands more energy, more water, and more space. The same world that nurtures giants can turn against them if the balance shifts. Floods, droughts, or small changes in temperature can be catastrophic when a body must feed a heart as large as a barrel. Yet life keeps returning to gigantism again and again, as if drawn to the beauty of its own extremes. These creatures, the mammal megafauna of the Eocene, were symbols of Earth's recovery. They were not the replacements of the dinosaurs, but rather a new expression of abundance. Each carried within its bones the story of survival, of a lineage that had outlived extinction and found new ways to fill the spaces left behind. In their slow, massive movements, The planet itself seemed to breathe. The forests swayed under their weight, the rivers parted gently around their legs, and the ground they walked upon was softened by their passing. For millions of years, they ruled quietly, not through dominance or violence, but through presence, vast, calm, and certain. And then, as always, time moved forward. The climate shifted again. Forests gave way to open grasslands. The world began to favor speed and endurance over mass and stillness. The giants would fade, replaced by others that were smaller, swifter, and more efficient. But their legacy endured. They proved that life, when given the chance, will always reach upward and outward, testing the limits of what is possible. The crown of size is passed from one age to another, from reptile to mammal, from swamp to savanna. Extinction may change the players, but it never ends the game. For in every age, on every continent, life has dreamed of being immense, of walking the world not as prey or predator, but as a moving piece of the land itself. The Eocene giants were that dream made flesh, reminders that even after chaos, the earth always remembers how to create wonder again. The world that had once belonged to gentle giants was beginning to change. The forests still spread wide, the rivers still wound slow and green, but beneath that calm, a quiet tension grew. The herbivores that grazed among the ferns had grown large and confident, but nature, as always, balanced the scales. Wherever prey multiplied, predators followed. And so, in the middle of the Eocene, the earth gave rise to hunters that seemed too fierce for such a tranquil world. Across the open plains and coastal marshes of what is now Mongolia, there walked a creature that would one day baffle paleontologists. It was not a cat, nor a bear, nor a wolf, but something older, stranger, and far larger. Its skull stretched longer than that of a horse, its jaws filled with teeth shaped for tearing through bone and flesh. Its name, given millions of years later, would be Andrewsarchus, the largest land-dwelling carnivorous mammal ever discovered. Imagine it standing taller than a man at the shoulder, its massive body supported by limbs built for strength rather than speed. Its head alone could span nearly a meter, the jaws capable of cracking open shells or bones as easily as fruit. Fossils suggest it may have lived along ancient coastlines, scavenging carcasses washed ashore or hunting smaller mammals that wandered too close to the water. Its exact nature remains a mystery. Some scientists believe it was related to hoofed animals rather than to wolves or cats, a predator born from a lineage that once grazed peacefully. Its teeth were not perfectly suited for slicing like those of a true carnivore, but had the blunt power of a creature that ate whatever it found, flesh, bone, or carrion. In a sense, Andrewsarchus represented an era of experimentation. Evolution, still feeling its way through the aftermath of catastrophe, had not yet settled on familiar designs. The world was full of strange hybrids, creatures that looked familiar at a glance but revealed alien shapes upon closer look. The Eocene was not a steady age. It was wild, restless, and full of possibilities. Far to the south, in the warm rivers of what is now Africa, another lineage had taken a different path. There, great crocodiles lurked beneath the surface, their lineage stretching back to the time of the dinosaurs. They were survivors from another age, barely changed since the days of Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops. While the world above them evolved and transformed, they remained patient and timeless, waiting in the murky depths. One species, Dinosuchus, had long vanished, but its relatives lingered on, immense, armored, and nearly invisible beneath the green water. Some reached lengths of 10 meters, their eyes and nostrils barely breaking the surface as they drifted in silence. They were the last living shadows of the Mesozoic, proof that not all of the old predators had disappeared. They did not need to change. The world came and went, Forests turned to deserts, mountains rose and crumbled, but the crocodiles simply waited. And while they held their place in the rivers, a new kind of predator began to move toward the sea. Along the coastal plains of what would one day become Pakistan and Egypt, four-legged hunters prowled near the water's edge. They looked like wolves, but their limbs were thick and their feet broad, better for swimming than running. They were ambulocheetahs, the walking whales. They hunted in shallow bays and estuaries, using stealth and patience like crocodiles. Their jaws were long and full of sharp teeth, their ears adapted to hear both above and below the water. In them, evolution was testing an idea that would one day reshape the oceans. Over generations, these creatures began to spend more time in the water than on land. Their legs grew shorter, their tails stronger, their bodies sleeker. They became more at home in the sea than the shore. The descendants of these hunters would eventually shed their limbs altogether and become the first true whales. It is a strange thought that the mightiest predators of the Eocene land would one day rule the ocean instead. But such was the spirit of this time: constant movement, constant transformation. Across the planet, the ecosystems had grown complex and dangerous. The forests of Europe hid ambush predators that hunted from the shadows. The plains of North America were patrolled by bear-sized carnivores with teeth like knives. In the seas, sharks returned to dominance, gliding through coral reefs that shimmered with color. The rivers belonged to crocodiles, the skies to birds, the land to mammals that no longer hid, but hunted. Earth had become a patchwork of danger and beauty, a living mosaic of power, balance, and adaptation. Every continent pulsed with its own rhythm, every creature carved from the same shared urgency to survive. And though the age of dinosaurs had ended long ago, the world was no less alive with wonder. It had merely changed the shape of its monsters. The thunder of footsteps had become the crash of waves. Scales had become fur. Wings had become fins. Yet the story remained the same: life rising again and again, reshaping itself into something fierce, something vast, something unforgettable. The Eocene was a world both peaceful and perilous, a planet where beauty and danger walked side by side, and where every shadow, whether on land or beneath the sea, held the shape of a hunter waiting to move. Beneath the calm surface of the Eocene seas, the world was changing again. The warmth that wrapped the planet had transformed the oceans into vast, fertile basins, rich with life. Coral reefs spread across shallow waters, their shapes glowing with color in the filtered light. Plankton bloomed in endless clouds, feeding fish that shimmered like liquid silver. From the coasts of Africa to the shores of North America, the sea had become a cradle of abundance. But in that same abundance, a darker rhythm was beginning to stir. The oceans were no longer just places of peace and renewal. They were becoming arenas of power, where survival once again depended on strength, speed, and hunger. Among the new rulers of this underwater world was a creature so strange and powerful that for many years its fossils were mistaken for those of sea serpents. It was called Basilosaurus, which means king lizard, though it was no lizard at all. It was a whale, one of the first true whales, yet its body carried echoes of the land it had left behind. Stretching nearly 18 meters from head to tail, Basilosaurus was long and slender, more like a giant eel than the rounded whales of today. Its skull was narrow and lined with sharp, conical teeth that interlocked like a predator's trap. In its jaws, it held the balance between two worlds: the gentle filter feeders that would come after it, and the land-dwelling hunters from which it had evolved. Its bite was powerful enough to crush the bones of its prey, and fossils show that it fed not just on fish, but on other whales, smaller, less adapted cousins that still clung to the shallows. Its skeleton reveals remnants of tiny hind limbs, each no longer useful for walking but still present, delicate and ghostly reminders of the land it once knew. When Basilosaurus moved through the sea, it did not glide gracefully like modern whales. It writhed and undulated, its long body twisting like a serpent's, propelling itself through the water with eerie precision. The oceans around it were filled with motion and noise. Schools of early fish darted between reefs, chased by predators that had risen from ancient lineages. Sharks, survivors of every extinction before this one, had regained their dominance. They were faster and leaner now, their senses sharpened by millions of years of competition. Some species grew to lengths of 6 or 7 meters, their eyes always searching, their bodies tuned to detect even the faintest pulse of blood in the water. The balance of power shifted constantly. In the deep, sharks hunted ceaselessly, their movements silent and efficient. Near the surface, Basilosaurus reigned, its massive jaws cutting through pods of dolphins and early whales. Every encounter in these waters was a test of endurance, of awareness, of instinct. In this new age of marine life, survival no longer belonged to the small or the passive. It belonged to those who could adapt to both the chaos and the calm. The oceans had become the deadliest frontier on Earth, and every creature that swam within them carried the mark of the struggle. Yet even in their danger, these seas were beautiful. Imagine diving beneath the surface in that time, shafts of golden light piercing the green-blue water, rays gliding like living shadows, coral forests rising like cities from the seafloor. Between them moved creatures of every color and shape, schools of fish that sparkled like scattered jewels, turtles the size of tables, ammonites still lingering in the deeper currents. And in that beauty, the great hunters passed silently. The shadow of Basilosaurus would slide over the sand, its long tail undulating with slow, hypnotic rhythm. Sharks circled far below, their forms flickering in and out of the light. Sometimes, the silence would break with a single strike, a flash, a twist, a burst of red, and then the water would calm again, as if nothing had happened. The reign of these predators lasted for millions of years, shaping everything that lived in the ocean. Smaller whales evolved to escape or hide, forming tight-knit groups that swam in unison. Fish developed speed and schooling behavior, moving as one to confuse their hunters. Even plankton, microscopic and defenseless, adapted their cycles to the rhythm of light and season, creating waves of bloom that could feed or starve an entire ecosystem. Every life in the sea learned to listen to the presence of danger. The click of a whale's jaw, the flick of a shark's tail, the stillness that came before a strike, all became part of the silent language of survival. The Eocene seas were no longer gentle. They pulsed with hunger and power, filled with echoes of an older world where life was as violent as it was beautiful. Yet in their vastness, they also carried the seeds of what was to come, the song of future whales, the glide of dolphins, the endless patterns of movement that would one day define the ocean as we know it. For now, though, it was the age of predators. The world's greatest hunters had returned, not on land, but beneath the waves. The oceans, once the cradle of life, had become its most dangerous kingdom, silent, endless, and alive with the rhythm of pursuit. The warmth that had wrapped the planet for millions of years began, at last, to fade. It did not happen suddenly, but softly, almost without notice. Seasons that had once blurred together began to find their rhythm again. The air thinned, the rains came less often, and a subtle chill crept into the wind. For the first time since the world's fevered rebirth, the earth began to cool. It was the end of the Eocene, and the planet was about to change in ways that would reshape every forest, river, and creature upon it. In the far south, Where endless jungles once reached toward the horizon, something new began to form. The air grew dry and still, and snow, something the earth had not seen in tens of millions of years, began to fall upon the highlands of Antarctica. At first, it melted quickly, turning to gray water that slipped down ancient valleys. But as the years stretched into millennia, the snow lingered longer, layer upon layer building quietly upon itself. Ice, that patient sculptor of the world, began to take hold. Antarctica, once a green continent filled with trees and mosses, became the planet's first cradle of ice. Glaciers crept across its slopes, slow as thought, reflecting sunlight back into space and cooling the air even more. What began as a whisper of winter grew into a voice that the whole earth would soon hear. Far to the north, the lush jungles that had once covered Europe and North America started to retreat. The warmth that had fed them faded, and with it, the endless humidity that had once filled the air. Trees dropped their leaves earlier each year. Ferns and palms that had grown for millions of seasons began to vanish, replaced by shrubs and grasses better suited to dry winds. The forests thinned into open woodlands, then into the first true plains. Animals adapted in kind. The creatures that had once thrived in the Eocene's heavy warmth found themselves facing longer droughts and colder nights. Some migrated toward the equator, chasing the last remnants of tropical air. Others evolved into new shapes altogether. Small, nimble grazers appeared, their limbs lengthening, their senses sharpening. They no longer hid beneath endless canopies of leaves. Instead, they moved through open spaces, learning to run rather than climb, to watch the horizon rather than the treetops. Predators changed as well. The great ambush hunters of the forest began to give way to creatures built for endurance, able to chase their prey across wide and open ground. Evolution, once shaped by the shadows of trees, now listened to the rhythm of wind and distance. In the oceans, the cooling was slower, but just as profound. Warm currents that had flowed freely between the poles began to shift. When Antarctica separated from South America, a ring of water formed around it, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, isolating the continent and locking it further into cold. This current changed everything. It sealed the planet's southern pole in ice and altered global circulation, sending cooler waters sweeping across the world. Marine life felt the shift first. Coral reefs that had stretched far from the equator began to shrink, forced back toward warmer regions. Plankton communities changed, their tiny shells recording the chemical story of the Earth's cooling breath. Whales, now fully aquatic, began migrating with the seasons, following the movements of food across the changing seas. For the first time, the oceans carried the faint heartbeat of ice. On land, color drained slowly from the landscape. The deep greens of the Eocene faded into browns, golds, and grays. The light itself changed, sharpened by clearer air. It was no longer filtered through thick canopies and mist, but fell openly across wide fields. Grasses spread where jungles had once stood, their blades catching the sun like the surface of a restless sea. The world was quieter now. Gone was the endless hum of insects that had filled the tropical air, replaced by the sighing of wind over the plains. The balance of life was shifting, not toward destruction, but toward a new kind of order, one built on adaptability and endurance rather than abundance. This was the first whisper of the world we would one day recognize. The seasons grew more distinct, the skies bluer, the nights colder. Migration became a rhythm that shaped countless generations, guiding animals across continents in search of warmth and food. Plants followed the patterns of light, blooming and sleeping in time with the turning year. In the south, the ice grew thicker, pressing down upon the land, carving valleys that would one day hold the memory of ancient rivers. It spread outward like a slow tide, a quiet force rewriting the surface of the earth. And though much of the planet still remained warm, the seeds of the ice ages were being planted. What had begun as a lush greenhouse world was transforming into something more balanced, more intricate, and more fragile. The first chill of winter had returned to the planet's breath. The Eocene's long summer was ending, and with it, an age of endless green. Yet, in the fading warmth, life did not falter. It simply shifted, as it always had, finding beauty even in change. Across the continents, the wind moved through open grass for the first time, carrying with it the scent of distant ice, a promise of what the earth was slowly becoming. The cooling of the world continued, soft and steady, like a long exhale after an age of breathless warmth. Forests gave way to open spaces, grasses spread across the land in great, swaying fields. The air was clearer now, the seasons sharper, and the horizon stretched farther than it had for millions of years. In this new world of distance and light, something extraordinary began to rise. It was the Oligocene, and on the broad plains of Central Asia, life was once again reaching upward. From the scattered remnants of the early rhinoceroses, creatures that had once roamed the dense Eocene forests, a new form began to emerge. They grew larger with each passing generation, their bodies expanding to meet the wide open world around them. Trees were fewer, leaves higher, and survival now required height as much as strength. And so appeared Paraceratherium, the greatest land mammal that ever lived. If you were to stand beside it, you would feel small in its shadow. It stood nearly 6 meters, tall at the shoulder, its head reaching higher than the tallest giraffe. From the tip of its nose to the end of its tail, it stretched nearly 8 meters in length. Some weighed as much as 20 tons, more than a modern herd of elephants combined. Its neck was long and muscular, built to reach the tops of trees. Its legs were thick as pillars, supporting a body shaped like a moving hill. Despite its size, Paraceratherium was gentle. It was a browser, a leaf eater, a creature of patience. Its lips were flexible and strong, able to pluck leaves and branches from trees that no other animal could reach. Each day it wandered through ancient valleys that are now deserts, stripping canopies bare with quiet precision. It lived in a world that was vast and still forming. Mountains were rising in the north, where India had collided with Asia, giving birth to the Himalayas. Rivers flowed from their newborn peaks, carving new paths through the land. Across these plains, herds of smaller animals grazed in the open, early horses, antelope-like creatures, and nimble predators that darted through the tall grass. When Paraceratherium walked, the ground seemed to answer, each step pressed deep into the soil, shaping the land beneath its weight. It was too large to hide, too slow to flee, and too powerful to fear. Even the predators of its time, agile hunters the size of lions, gave it wide passage. The mere sound of its approach, the low tremor of the earth, the distant rhythm of enormous feet was enough to clear its path. Fossil bones of this creature have been found across Asia, from Mongolia to Pakistan, scattered through ancient riverbeds and stone deserts. Some are so large that early explorers mistook them for the bones of giant dinosaurs. But they belong to mammals, warm-blooded, soft-skinned, and alive in an age that had long outgrown the reptile's rule. Its skull was long and high, with nasal openings that suggest a small trunk or large upper lip, perhaps used to grass branches. Its teeth were broad and ridged, perfect for grinding the fibrous leaves of a cooler, drier world. Every feature of its body told the same story. It was built not for violence, but endurance. To live large, to walk far, to outlast the seasons. The world around Paraceratherium was no longer dominated by jungles. The Earth's great forests had retreated toward the equator, leaving open spaces where sunlight touched the ground for the first time in ages. Grasses grew in endless stretches, rippling in waves under the wind. The creatures that had once hidden among trees now lived in the open, their shapes evolving to match this new expanse. To see a herd of Paraceratherium crossing such a plain would have been like watching moving hills against a pale sky. They traveled slowly, their heads swaying with each step, their massive shadows gliding over the grass. Calves followed beside their mothers, protected by the sheer bulk of the herd. At watering holes, their reflections rippled beside those of smaller creatures who watched from a careful distance, as though in reverence of the giants that shared their world. And yet, for all their size, they left almost no mark on the memory of humankind. Millions of years later, when their bones would be found and named, few outside the world of science would know they had ever existed. No ancient myths carried their image. No stories of monsters or gods remembered their shape. They walked the earth in silence, towering and magnificent, and then, as gently as they had come, they were gone. Their disappearance was gradual, written into the quiet changes of climate and time. As the planet cooled further, the forests they depended on began to shrink. The grasses that covered the plains could not feed such enormous bodies, and new kinds of herbivores, smaller, faster, more efficient, took their place. The age of the great browsers faded, replaced by the age of grazers and runners. But for a moment in the long history of life, Earth had created something that matched the size and grandeur of imagination itself, a living monument to growth, endurance, and the boundless creativity of evolution. The wind that once brushed against their sides still moves across the same land today, now dry and bare. The valleys they once filled with their slow thunder lie quiet under the sun. Yet in the stone bones buried beneath those ancient plains, the memory remains. A time when giants walked the earth, and the sky itself seemed to bend to meet them. As the giants of the Oligocene moved across the open plains, the quiet world beneath them stirred with new ambition. Life, as it always had, answered power with power, size with strategy. The towering browsers that had come to dominate the land brought with them a new kind of challenge. To hunt them, evolution began to shape creatures that relied not on strength alone, but on patience, intelligence, and something entirely new, cooperation. The world was cooler now, and drier. The great forests that once blanketed continents had thinned into patches of woodland and broad stretches of grass. Herds of massive herbivores grazed in these open spaces, their shadows long beneath the sun. Each day they wandered in quiet procession, feeding on the shrubs and young trees that dotted the landscape, and trailing behind them, unseen but ever present, were the hunters. They came in many forms. Some looked like wolves, others like bears, though they were neither. Their bodies were longer, their limbs more powerful, their faces stretched into narrow muzzles, filled with sharp slicing teeth. Scientists would later call them amphicyonids, or bear dogs. They were among the first great predators to roam the plains, moving with a mixture of grace and menace, equally at home in the chase and the struggle. The bear dogs hunted alone at first, stalking their prey through long hours of silence. But soon, evolution began to favor those who worked together. A single predator could not hope to bring down a beast many times its size, yet several working as one could succeed where individuals failed. The first traces of this change can still be read in the bones they left behind, marks of teeth in patterns that tell the story of multiple attackers striking in unison, each one playing its part in the hunt. Imagine them moving across the grasslands in the fading light, their forms low and fluid, their breathing steady and measured. The wind carried scents over great distances, and their noses could read it like a map. The smell of dust, of trampled grass, of blood not yet spilled. They knew when the herds were near, when the young or the old had strayed too far. They learned to wait, to circle, to anticipate. When the time came, they moved together. Some drove the prey forward, others cut across its path, and still others waited for the moment when exhaustion and panic would break its strength. There was no language between them, only instinct, sharpened by survival and passed down through countless generations. With each hunt, the coordination grew more refined. The chase became not just an act of hunger, but a kind of intelligence. Fossils tell these stories in quiet detail. Bones of ancient herbivores, their surfaces etched with crescent-shaped bite marks, reveal where tendons were torn and muscles ripped away. In some, the wounds show patterns, marks from multiple individuals attacking from different angles, each strike deliberate and placed. These were not chaotic assaults, but rehearsed movements, perfected through time. Evolution, through need and opportunity, had invented teamwork. Alongside the bear dogs came other predators, each adapted to its own way of living and hunting. Among them were the early ancestors of the saber-tooth cats, though they did not yet bear the full, curved daggers their descendants would wield. Their jaws were already changing, their teeth lengthening, their skulls broadening to anchor stronger muscles. They were built for short bursts of power, ambushing prey from cover rather than chasing it across open ground. The smaller predators hunted in their shadows, scavenging the remains of their kills or snatching at the weak and unwary. The plains were alive with motion, every creature testing its limits, every generation refining the art of survival. It was during this time that the balance between hunter and hunted grew more intricate than ever before. The herbivores formed herds for protection, moving in close formation, using their size and numbers to shield the young. Their movements became rhythmic, their migrations timed to the changing seasons. The predators responded in kind, following the herds across continents, their paths intertwined like dancers in an endless, silent performance. The air of the Oligocene carried a new kind of energy. The age of stillness had ended. Every living thing moved now with purpose, driven by instinct and by memory. The chases left trails etched into the soil, lines of pursuit and escape that vanished with the next rain, but whose stories were written deeper in the bones of those who lived and died there. Over time, the idea of the pack, though never conscious, became one of evolution's most remarkable experiments. It changed everything. It allowed predators to hunt prey far larger than themselves, to share the spoils of success, to survive leaner seasons. It also rewired their senses. They learned awareness of others, of position and timing, of when to act and when to hold back. What began as survival slowly became strategy, and strategy became cooperation. In these early hunters, one can trace the first glimmer of something that would echo far into the future, the understanding that unity can be a weapon as powerful as any tooth or claw. The great predators of this time ruled not through size alone, but through coordination, through patience, through the quiet precision of the chase. And as they moved through the tall grass, their shadows merging and parting beneath the sun, they reshaped the very rhythm of the world. The plains no longer belonged only to the giants that walked upon them, but to those who had learned how to move together in silence, to hunt as one. The slow dance of the continents never truly stopped. Beneath the calm of the Oligocene skies, far below the forests and plains, the earth's deep currents of rock continued to move, patient, steady, unstoppable. Mountains were being born in silence, oceans were shifting their breath, and the face of the planet was quietly remade. In the heart of this slow transformation, one event stood above all others. From the south, an entire continent was on the move. India, which had once drifted freely across the vastness of the ancient Tethys Sea, was closing in on Asia. For tens of millions of years, it had been sailing northward, carried by the invisible motion of Earth's plates. Now, its long journey reached its end. When the two landmasses met, the impact was monumental. It was not a sudden crash, but a slow, grinding embrace that would last millions of years. The edges of the continents folded and buckled, layer upon layer of rock pressing upward. The ocean floor that once lay between them rose skyward, becoming the highest mountain range on Earth, the Himalayas. At first, the peaks were low, their slopes softened by rivers and forests. But as the collision continued, the mountains grew sharper and higher, piercing the clouds. Wind and rain shaped their faces, carving valleys and ridges that would one day cradle glaciers. The atmosphere itself changed. The new mountains pulled moisture from the air, feeding rivers that flowed across the growing continents. These rivers carried silt and minerals into the seas, altering the chemistry of the oceans. As the land rose, so too did the patterns of air and water around it. The Himalayas became not only a monument of stone, but a force that shaped global climate. The rearrangement of continents also changed the path of the oceans. The closing of the Tethys Sea and the opening of new passages between the polar regions created fresh currents that circled the planet. Cold water from the poles began to flow freely, cooling the global climate even further. The warm, greenhouse world that had nurtured the Eocene's jungles was now fading into something drier, sharper, and colder. The transformation could be felt everywhere. In the south, Antarctica, now fully isolated by a ring of circulating water, became a frozen continent. The ice that had begun to form in the previous age spread outward, thickening into vast glaciers that glittered beneath the pale light. Each winter, the ice stretched farther, reflecting sunlight back into space and deepening the planet's cool. The balance of warmth and cold had shifted for good. Across the northern continents, the lush forests of the past continued to shrink. Their retreat left behind open spaces, endless, wind-touched plains where grasses began to flourish. These plants, once humble and small, found new strength in the changing climate. They grew dense and tough, spreading across entire regions, turning what had once been jungles into savannas and steppes. The rise of grass reshaped life itself. The herbivores that had once browsed on soft leaves now faced a new kind of food, one that was fibrous and low to the ground. Teeth evolved to grind rather than tear, and legs grew longer for running across open distances. Herds began to form, moving together across the plains in rhythmic waves of motion. Behind them came the predators, lean and swift, born for endurance rather than ambush. The world was learning a new rhythm, one driven by movement. The calm, enclosed forests of earlier ages had given way to vast horizons. The wind carried the scent of dry soil and rain, of grass bending under hooves. The calls of animals traveled farther now, unbroken by walls of trees. From high above, the earth would have looked more familiar to our eyes. The outlines of the continents were beginning to resemble those we know today. North America had drifted westward, South America remained an island still separated from the north, and Africa continued its slow approach toward Europe. Australia, far to the south, began to stretch away into isolation, carrying with it a collection of creatures that would evolve into forms found nowhere else on the planet. The tectonic forces below never rested. Each collision and fracture, each uplift and subsidence, redrew the world's boundaries. What to living creatures seemed eternal, a mountain, a sea, a continent, was to the earth only a passing shape. As the land masses settled into their new places, the climate continued to cool. The balance of life adjusted with quiet precision. The great mountains cast shadows that stretched for miles, shaping deserts on one side and rivers on the other. The oceans pulsed with new currents that carried warmth north and cold south, creating the first hints of the climate systems that still govern the planet today. Every creature alive in this time was part of that slow rearrangement. Herds crossed valleys that would one day be buried in ice. Birds flew along coastlines that would vanish beneath rising mountains. Even the winds changed course, whispering through new corridors between peaks that had not existed before. The earth had begun to resemble itself, not the chaotic cradle of the early ages, but the balanced, breathing world that would carry life into the ages ahead. The Himalayas rose like the planet's memory of its own strength, their snow-capped summits catching the first light of every dawn. Around them, rivers and grasslands stretched outward, and the continents settled into place. The world, restless and ever-moving, had paused just long enough to become familiar, and in that pause, beneath the shifting skies, life continued, smaller now, faster, wiser, walking across a planet that was finally beginning to take the shape of home. The world had changed its rhythm. The soft forests and tangled swamps of earlier ages had thinned, giving way to open air, sunlight, and wind. Across the continents, what began as scattered patches of green had spread into a new and endless world. The grasslands. From horizon to horizon, blades of grass rippled like waves beneath the sun, bending and whispering in the steady breath of the earth. It is difficult to imagine how much this quiet plant would transform everything that lived upon the land. Grass was simple in form, yet powerful in consequence. Its leaves grew from the base rather than the tip, allowing it to recover quickly when eaten or burned. Its roots reached deep, holding the soil together even as wind and rain reshaped the world above. Its growth was constant, tireless, and indifferent to being grazed. In a planet that had known towering trees and delicate ferns, grass was something new, humble but relentless. For the animals that roamed this changing landscape, survival became a matter of adaptation. The leaves of trees had fed browsers for millions of years, but now the richest food lay close to the ground. The early grazers that turned to grass soon faced an invisible challenge. It was tough. Its blades were laced with tiny grains of silica, sharp as sandpaper, wearing down the teeth of any creature that fed upon it. Evolution, quiet and precise, began to respond. The mouths of herbivores transformed. The old, shearing teeth of forest feeders were replaced by broad, ridged molars designed for grinding. Their jaws grew deeper, their muscles stronger, and their skulls longer to house these new engines of endurance. Each bite became a slow, circular motion, a rhythm of patience, a partnership between plant and animal. Among the first to master this new diet were the ancestors of horses, rhinos, and antelope. Their bodies grew lighter and taller, their legs lengthened, muscles stretching into shapes built for speed. On the open plains, there was no canopy to hide beneath, no branches to cling to, only space and motion. To survive, they had to move, swiftly, endlessly, together, and so the herds were born. No longer creatures of solitude, grazers began to travel in great numbers, moving like rivers of life across the grass. Safety was found not in hiding, but in company. Each pair of eyes watched for movement, each ear turned toward the wind. The herd became a living network of awareness, bound not by thought, but by instinct. When one fled, all fled. When one rested, the others stood guard. Predators evolved beside them, shaped by the same wide horizon. The forests that had once favored ambush were gone, replaced by open ground where only speed could bring down prey. The hunters grew longer-limbed, leaner, their lungs expanding to chase for miles rather than strike from shadows. The age of running had begun. The world itself adjusted to the rhythm of hooves. Paths worn by migrating herds became corridors for wind and foreign. Rain, dung enriched the soil, feeding the next cycle of growth. Lightning storms swept across the plains, igniting fires that devoured the old grass and cleared space for the new. The smoke rose in thin gray sheets, and after the flames died, green shoots would return within days, fresh and full of life. In time, grass would spread to every continent except the frozen poles, shaping entire ecosystems in its image. It softened mountainsides, filled river valleys, and wrapped the earth in its green quilt. Even the sky seemed to reflect its influence, shimmering with the heat that rose from the plains. Every creature that walked through this world carried the mark of its presence. The structure of jaws, the length of limbs, the complexity of behavior all traced their origins to this quiet revolution. Evolution had discovered endurance, and yet, for all its power, the transformation of the planet was peaceful. There was no great cataclysm, no fiery event to mark the beginning of this new age. Grass conquered the world with patience. It grew, was eaten, and grew again. Its blades whispered in the wind, unhurried and unending. Life adapted around it not through conflict, but through adjustment. Even the atmosphere changed subtly. The spread of grasslands increased the amount of oxygen released into the air, and their roots drew carbon from the sky into the soil. The planet cooled further, its climate stabilizing into a pattern of seasons and migrations. The world was no longer ruled by towering trees or boiling seas, but by the slow rhythm of growth and regrowth, a heartbeat steady and sure. Through this transformation, a new kind of beauty emerged. The plains stretched far beyond sight, their colors shifting with the light, golden at dusk, silver beneath the moon, emerald when the rains returned. Herds moved across them like living shadows, their forms dissolving into the distance. Overhead, the sky opened wide, a canvas for storms and birds, and the long curve of the sun. The age of grass and teeth was more than a change in diet or terrain. It was a new pattern of existence, one built on endurance, community, and adaptation. Grass had not simply covered the earth, it had rewritten the story of life upon it, and as the wind carried the scent of rain across the plains, the world settled into this new rhythm, steady and alive. A single plant, quiet and unassuming, had reshaped the surface of an entire planet, and in doing so, had changed the course of every living thing that followed. The world was wide and open now. The endless plains that had unfurled beneath the cooling sky shimmered under the sun, their grasses rippling like water. Forests had retreated into distant clusters, and the wind flowed freely across the land, unbroken and unending. It was a world of movement, of space, sight, and silence. Here, the rules of life began to change once again. No longer did survival belong to those who could hide or climb, it now belonged to those who could run. The herds that grazed across these new grasslands were vast, stretching for miles, their shapes shifting like clouds as they moved. They were built for motion, with long, slender limbs and deep chests that held powerful lungs. They grazed, rested, and wandered in rhythm with the seasons, crossing rivers and valleys in search of fresh growth. But where there are grazers, there are always those who follow. In the shadow of these herds, predators began to evolve in new and remarkable ways. The dense forests of the past had once favored the silent leap, the quick strike, the ambush. But in this new world of open horizons, stealth alone was useless. The grass offered little cover, and prey could see danger from great distances. To hunt here required patience, endurance, and speed. And so, evolution began to sculpt creatures that could chase rather than pounce. Their bodies grew lean and aerodynamic, their legs elongated, their hearts and lungs strengthened to sustain the long pursuit, their muscles filled with fibers built for endurance rather than raw strength. Some could run for miles without rest, pacing themselves behind their prey until exhaustion did what claws could not. This was the dawn of the age of running. The first horses appeared as small, delicate animals no larger than dogs, their hooves splitting into simple, hardened toes suited for gripping soft soil. Over time, those toes fused, forming the single hoof we know today, a perfect tool for speed. They shed unnecessary weight, their bodies stretching into elegant forms of efficiency. Their teeth, shaped for grinding the coarse grasses of the plains, became worn and yellow with dust, but their legs grew powerful and tireless. They could not fight or hide, but they could run, and that was enough. Chasing them were the early hunters of this new world, sleek and long-limbed, their bodies tuned to the rhythm of pursuit. Some were ancient ancestors of the great cats, though they did not yet have the spots or grace of the cheetahs to come. Others were the early kin of wolves, pack runners whose success depended not on claws alone, but on unity. The open plains became the stage for this endless dance, a world defined by motion. Each chase was a story of patience and timing. The predator would fix its gaze on a single animal, watching for the moment of weakness, the stumble, the hesitation. Then the chase began, slow at first, then faster, the two shapes moving in parallel, one ahead, one behind. For minutes or for miles, they would run, their hearts beating in rhythm with the earth. Fossil tracks still record their passing, long lines of hoofprints, spaced evenly and precise, pursued by a thinner trail of paws. The soil, pressed beneath their weight, hardened over the ages into stone. Even now, millions of years later, the lines tell a story that needs no words, the story of flight and pursuit, of the first true speed. The air of that world was alive with energy. Herds thundered across the ground in waves, raising dust that hung in the sunlight like mist. The smell of dry grass mixed with the scent of rain and sweat and life. Vultures circled high above, patient observers of the cycle below. Every sound, the pounding of hooves, the hiss of breath, the cry of the wind, was part of the same ancient rhythm. It was during this time that the first truly modern ecosystems took shape. The balance between hunter and hunted reached a kind of harmony that still endures today. Herbivores trimmed the grass, preventing the plains from becoming tangled. Predators kept the herd strong, removing the weak and the sick. Scavengers followed behind, ensuring nothing went to waste. Each creature had its place, each action its purpose, bound together by the quiet mathematics of life. The earth had found equilibrium not in stillness, but in motion. In this new age, the beauty of survival lay in its simplicity. The plains stretched on endlessly, but every life that crossed them was connected. The grazer, the runner, the hunter, the scavenger, the success of one depended upon the endurance of the other. The act of running, once a tool of escape, became a language of existence. Even the sky seemed to move in time with the life below. Clouds drifted in long, slow lines, mirroring the migration of herds. The sun arced in perfect rhythm, casting shadows that stretched and shrank across the day. The earth itself felt alive with momentum, as if the turning of its surface had merged with the motion of its creatures. This was not an age of giants or monsters, nor one of chaos and flame. It was an age of grace, the quiet mastery of adaptation. The planet had learned to breathe in stride, its living beings shaped by wind, horizon, and endurance. The plains, once empty, had become the lungs of the earth, filled with motion and life. And as the herds ran beneath the open sky, their hooves striking the ground like the beat of a drum, the planet's heart found a new rhythm, one of speed, strength, and balance. The quiet balance that had settled over the earth did not last forever. The planet, patient and ancient, has always carried fire beneath its calm surface, and in time, that fire rose again. Deep below the continents, molten rock pressed upward, searching for release. Cracks opened along the ocean floors, spilling rivers of lava into the seas. Mountains shuddered and split. Vast volcanic fields erupted one after another, painting the sky in ash. What had once been blue turned to gray, and the air itself grew heavy with dust and gas. The age of fire had returned. For millions of years, the planet had lived in rhythm with the grasslands, the winds, and the migrations of countless herds. But now, the earth exhaled its buried heat, and that breath carried both creation and destruction. The skies dimmed. Sunlight, once clear and golden, became weak and scattered. Days felt shorter, colder, muted beneath the ash that drifted across the world. The oceans absorbed strange new chemicals from the air, turning their surface waters darker and more acidic. The rain, when it came, carried the taste of stone. In some regions, the ash fell so thick that entire plains vanished beneath it. Forests that had survived for generations were smothered in silence. Rivers slowed, clogged with debris, then carved new paths when the old ones filled with silt. The land itself seemed restless, reshaping with each tremor and flood. But even in the haze, life endured. The creatures of this world had inherited the lessons of survival from every catastrophe before. They bent to the changing winds rather than breaking beneath them. In the tropics, where the heat remained, the skies burned red. Lightning flashed through ash clouds, igniting wildfires that swept across thousands of kilometers. The smell of smoke drifted for ages. Grasslands turned to embers, and herds fled before the glow. In the wake of the flames, the land was stripped bare, blackened, quiet, and waiting. And then, as it always had, life began again. Seeds that could lie dormant through drought and fire waited beneath the surface, waking when the rains returned. Grasses grew back quickly, tougher now, their roots reaching deeper into the earth. Small mammals emerged from burrows, blinking into the dim light, gathering what little food they could find. Each generation learned something: to run farther, to hide better, to eat what others could not. Far to the north and south, where sunlight weakened even more, ice began to spread. Winters lengthened into years, lakes froze, and the edges of glaciers crept down from the mountains. The same world that burned in one place froze in another. The planet had divided itself, half in fire, half in frost, and yet, in that contrast, something remarkable was taking shape. Species adapted to extremes, finding ways to survive in both heat and cold. Some mammals grew thicker fur and stored fat for the long winters. Others evolved to tolerate the heat and dust of the open plains. Birds, ever the wanderers, followed the shifting seasons, migrating farther than before. Life was learning flexibility, the art of bending. In the midst of hardship, the earth itself was experimenting. Volcanic activity released carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, while the growth of grasslands pulled it back out. The balance of gases in the air shifted constantly, making the planet breathe in unpredictable rhythms. The world was no longer stable, but alive in its instability, a living system in constant motion. The deserts that formed during this time were immense. They began as scars of drought and ash, but soon developed their own beauty. Sand replaced soil, wind became the sculptor, carving the land into waves and ridges. In these dry oceans of dust, new kinds of life appeared, small, tough, and clever. Reptiles that could hide beneath the surface, rodents that stored water in their bodies, insects that opened their wings only at night when the air cooled. Each sunrise brought a landscape that looked empty at first glance, yet every grain of sand hid something alive. The cycles of eruption and cooling repeated for ages. The Earth's face was never the same for long. Mountains rose where plains had been, rivers shifted course, entire regions vanished beneath lava and re-emerged centuries later, fertile and green. Through it all, life continued its quiet work, rebuilding, reshaping, learning. The creatures of this time did not thrive in abundance, but in endurance. They became specialists in resilience, their bodies and instincts crafted by change itself. When the skies finally cleared and sunlight returned, the world that emerged was new again. The air was cleaner, the soils richer from the minerals left by volcanic dust. Forests crept back across valleys, though they looked different from those before. Grasses spread once more, anchoring the land with their stubborn roots. The earth had survived another trial, and so had its creatures. The age of fire and dust had tested every form of life, teaching the same lesson in 1,000 quiet ways: that survival is not only about strength, but about patience. And as the winds carried away the last of the ash, the world exhaled once more. The air warmed, the light softened, and the cycle of renewal began again, proof that even through fire and frost, the story of life would always find a way to continue. The earth, though still restless, had found a quieter rhythm again. The fires had cooled, the winds had softened, and across the plains of Africa and Eurasia, the green returned, not the deep forests of old, but wide grasslands that rolled beneath the sun like ocean waves. In this open world, the sound of thunder was no longer just the voice of the sky, it was the sound of footsteps. From the scattered lineages of ancient mammals, a new kind of giant began to rise. They were not predators or armored beasts, but herbivores, gentle in nature yet immense in form. They were creatures of patience, of memory, of quiet strength. Among them walked Dinotherium, a relative of modern elephants, though stranger in shape. Its tusks curved downward from its lower jaw, like great ivory hooks. It used them not for battle, but for pulling down branches or digging roots from the soil. Standing over 3 meters tall at the shoulder, it moved with the slow certainty of something that had no need to hurry. Its ears flapped gently in the heat, its trunk swept the ground in graceful arcs, and its eyes, small and thoughtful, held the kind of calm one finds only in creatures that remember. Nearby, herds of mastodons wandered through cooler forests of the north. Their teeth were built for chewing the coarse leaves and bark that grew along the rivers. Their woolly hides carried the scent of moss and earth. When they moved, the ground trembled beneath them, yet their lives were quiet, their movements deliberate. And in between, across Asia and the distant Americas, lived the Gomphotheres, the experimenters of the elephant family. Some had 4 tusks, others long, flat jaws shaped for scooping up water plants. They explored every corner of the world that would have them, from tropical wetlands to mountain valleys. Each species seemed to test a different way of living, a different design for endurance. But what truly set these creatures apart was not their size, nor the shape of their tusks, but something deeper, something invisible. These giants were beginning to feel the first sparks of social awareness. Their lives were lived not alone, but together. They traveled in herds, family groups bound not by instinct alone, but by connection. Mothers led, daughters followed, sons wandered at the edge of the group until it was time to find their own way. Calves walked beneath a canopy of legs, protected from predators by a circle of enormous bodies. The young learned from the old, watched their gestures, and remembered. Memory, for these giants, was not just survival, it was wisdom. They remembered the paths to water during dry seasons, the locations of shade and shelter, the scents of distant storms. They remembered loss as well, the bones of fallen kin, revisited and touched by trunks in gestures that seem, even to us, to carry meaning. It was here, in this age, that the seeds of empathy took root. Their social bonds were not built on dominance, but on cooperation. When one was hurt, others waited. When a calf was frightened, the herd closed around it until it calmed. Their communication, low and resonant, could travel for kilometers through the ground. Vibrations felt more than heard, carrying reassurance, warning, and unity. In a world still shaped by droughts and floods, by the unpredictability of climate and land, cooperation became their greatest tool. Empathy itself became a survival strategy. The plains could be cruel, waterholes dried without warning, grasslands turned to dust, and predators watched from the shadows. But no single dinotherium or mastodon faced such hardship alone. They shared knowledge across generations, and in doing so, they shared hope. The success of one depended on the memory of another. Their intelligence was not the sharp cunning of the hunter, but the deep understanding of the wanderer, of a creature that must know the land as it knows itself. Their brains were vast, their minds layered with recognition and emotion. They grieved their dead, they comforted their young, they planned, they remembered, they cared, and through this empathy, they reshaped the world around them. Each day, their herds changed the land with their passage. Their weight carved paths through the grass, creating trails that smaller animals followed. Their dung fertilized the soil, spreading seeds across continents. They dug for water in dry riverbeds, leaving behind pools that birds and reptiles would drink from. Without realizing it, they became gardeners of the earth, carrying life wherever they roamed. From a distance, one might have seen only their size, mountains of flesh moving across the horizon. But up close, their world was delicate. The brush of trunks, the rumble of distant calls, the steady rhythm of breathing. They were the planet's gentle titans, both monumental and mindful. The rise of these true giants marked something quiet but profound, an age where intelligence began to walk hand in hand with empathy. Strength no longer meant destruction, but endurance. Power was not in the strike, but in the bond. For millions of years they flourished, crossing continents and climates, thriving in herds that mirrored the landscapes they moved through. And though many of their species would one day vanish, their spirit would linger in the few descendants that remain today, the elephants who still roam with the same patience, the same awareness, the same grace. Under the wide skies of that distant age, when the light softened across the plains and the air shimmered with heat, one could hear the faint, low call of the herd echoing across the land, a sound as old as time, carrying the memory of a world where kindness had begun to take shape in the hearts of giants. For millions of years, the world had been divided by oceans and isolation. The continents drifted quietly across the planet's face, each one carrying its own secret kingdoms of life. In the north, predators with sharp teeth and colder temperaments had evolved through the long rhythm of ice and thaw. In the south, where the air was warm and the forests dense, life had taken wilder forms, stranger, heavier, often slower, but no less fierce. Then, one day in the grand scale of Earth's time, the two worlds touched. The sea between North and South America began to close. Beneath the waves, volcanoes built a bridge of stone that slowly rose toward the light. It took millions of years, but at last, a narrow strip of land emerged, linking what had once been two separate realms. The Isthmus of Panama was born, and with it came one of the greatest biological exchanges in Earth's history. The great American interchange had begun. Through this slender passage, creatures began to cross. The northern world spilled its hunters and grazers southward. The southern continent sent its armored tanks and bird giants north. It was as if two vast experiments in evolution had suddenly met face to face. The first to make the journey were the wanderers, herds of deer-like mammals, wolves, cats, and elephants, drifting southward through the new corridor of land. They found rich forests waiting, filled with fruits, shade, and prey that had never seen their kind before. Meanwhile, from the south, lumbering shapes moved upward, strange and unfamiliar to northern eyes. Glyptodons, the armored ancestors of armadillos, rolled across the plains, their shells hard as stone and their tails tipped with clubs. Some were as large as cars, their armor patterned in honeycomb ridges that glistened beneath the sun. Close behind came the ground sloths, towering creatures with claws like scythes, their movements slow but deliberate. They rose on hind legs to strip entire trees bare, their strength unmatched by anything the North had known. But perhaps the most haunting of all were the terror birds. Standing over 3 meters tall, they strode northward on muscular legs, their feathers dark and coarse, their wings reduced to stumps. Their heads were weapons, hooked beaks sharp enough to crush bone, their eyes bright and unblinking. For millions of years, these birds had ruled South America in the absence of large mammalian predators. They hunted with precision, striking like living guillotines, their beaks cleaving through flesh and bone with terrifying speed. In the south, they had been unstoppable. In the north, they met new challenges. Waiting for them were creatures equally formidable, the saber-toothed cats. These northern predators had evolved for power and precision, their canines long as daggers, their bodies thick with muscle. They hunted in packs, using coordination and strength to bring down prey far larger than themselves. When the first terror birds crossed into their territory, the plains must have trembled with the clash of two ancient empires. The birds, fast and bold, relied on sudden strikes, while the cats, patient and silent, waited for the perfect moment. Each encounter was a contest not only of strength, but of adaptation, and slowly, as generations passed, the balance began to shift. The saber-toothed cats and wolves of the north proved better suited to the changing world. As climates cooled and forests gave way to open plains, agility and cooperation began to outweigh brute size and armor. The terror birds dwindled, their reign fading into memory. The massive glyptodons and ground sloths, too, began to retreat. Their heavy bodies, perfect for the calm and stable climates of the south, became a burden in the north's harsher, more variable lands. Yet even as extinction took its toll, the exchange left behind new wonders. Armadillos settled into smaller, hardier forms, thriving in deserts and scrublands where few others could survive. The ancestors of opossums spread across continents, their clever hands and adaptable diets making them survivors of all seasons. The great cats of the north, now finding new prey and new challenges, grew stronger and more diverse. Lions, jaguars, and pumas traced their ancestry back to this ancient bridge of land. The collision of continents reshaped not just the map, but the living balance of the planet. New ocean currents began to flow around the Americas, altering global climate. The Atlantic and Pacific seas separated fully, their waters no longer mingling as before. The world cooled, the poles thickened with ice, and the rhythm of the ice ages began to take hold. And through it all, the creatures adapted once more. Some evolved to endure the cold, growing thicker fur and longer limbs for distance and endurance. Others faded into the fossil record, their stories preserved in the earth they once walked. The Great American Interchange was not a war of invasion, but a test of endurance, a vast experiment in life's capacity to change. It was not the fiercest who survived, nor the largest, but those who could bend without breaking, who could find balance in a world reshaped by motion. Today, when we see an armadillo burrowing through the soil of Texas or a jaguar padding silently through the forests of South America, we are witnessing the echoes of that ancient meeting, a story of continents colliding, of worlds blending, and of life forever learning to adapt. The bridge that once connected two separate realms still exists, though buried in time and memory. Beneath its soil lies the record of a grand migration, a moment when the earth itself seemed to inhale and exhale, mixing its creatures like pigments in a painting, and from that blending, creating the living masterpiece we know today. The earth began to slow its breath again. After ages of warmth and motion, a stillness crept across the world. The air grew sharper, the winds colder, the sun's warmth, once unbroken, now met a planet tilted and turning through cycles of light and shadow. Mountains gathered snow that never melted, and glaciers, like slow rivers of stone, began their long descent from the poles. This was the birth of ice. It did not arrive all at once, but in steady, patient waves. For tens of thousands of years, snow fell, layer upon layer, each winter lasting a little longer than the one before. The weight of it pressed upon the continents, turning valleys into frozen plains, carving ridges into deep scars. The world that had once been green and golden turned pale and silent, covered in the shimmering armor of ice. Across the northern lands, the glaciers grew to impossible heights, kilometers thick, stretching from horizon to horizon. They moved slowly, yet with unstoppable force, grinding mountains to dust beneath their weight. Rivers froze in their tracks, forests vanished under the crushing weight. The very shape of continents was changing, molded by the patient hands of cold. The oceans, too, began to retreat. So much water was locked away in ice that the seas fell, exposing vast stretches of land that had never felt the sun before. Where there had once been water, now there were plains of frost and tundra. New bridges of land appeared, linking islands and continents together, paths that life would one day follow. But life, as it always does, found a way to adapt. The cold that silenced the forests also brought forth new forms of resilience. The creatures that survived here were not the giants of the old warm ages, nor the tropical wanderers of the Eocene. These were beings shaped by hardship, wrapped in fur, forged in patience, and guided by instinct older than memory. Across the frozen grasslands of Eurasia, herds of woolly mammoths began to roam. They were vast and solemn, with curved tusks like crescent moons and coats so thick that snow clung to their backs without melting. Beneath their shaggy fur, their hearts beat slow and steady, built for endurance. They dug through the snow with their tusks, uncovering the dry grasses buried below, and traveled together in small herds, bound by memory and warmth. Near them moved the woolly rhinoceros, heavier and more solitary, its skin layered with thick fur that rippled in the wind. Its great horn curved forward, sweeping aside the snow as it searched for roots and frozen herbs. In the distance, smaller herds of musk oxen clustered together for warmth, their breath rising in faint clouds that froze and fell again as ice. They huddled in circles when blizzards came, their young protected in the center, living fortresses of patience and care. The air itself had changed. It was dry and clear, almost empty, the kind of cold that carried sound for miles. The cracking of ice, the distant groan of glaciers, the muffled tread of herds, all of it blended into a slow, haunting rhythm. The world had grown quiet, but not lifeless. Beneath the frost, seeds slept, waiting for the sun's return. In the oceans, plankton drifted under sheets of ice, feeding fish that glowed in the deep. Even in this deep freeze, warmth could still be found, not in temperature, but in connection. Herds learned to move together, sharing heat and vigilance. Wolves hunted in packs, their breath rising white in the air as they shadowed the mammoths across the plains. Birds traveled thousands of kilometers each year, tracing the faint boundaries between seasons. Every heartbeat, every movement, was a small act of defiance against the cold. Far to the south, where the glaciers did not reach, the world felt their influence still. The winds carried dust from the frozen north, sprinkling it over the tropics and fertilizing the seas. The Earth's heartbeat slowed but remained steady. The rhythm of the ice ages began, a cycle of freezing and thawing that would repeat again and again, shaping not just the land, but the destiny of every creature upon it. Between the glaciers, pockets of life endured. Grasses bent beneath frost, but did not die. Forests retreated into sheltered valleys, where streams still ran beneath thin crusts of ice. The creatures that lived there, foxes, hares, owls, became small, swift, and cautious, perfectly attuned to scarcity. They lived on the edge of survival, and yet the edge held firm. Time passed differently in this frozen world. Seasons were measured not in months, but in centuries. Whole generations of animals lived and died beneath skies that never truly softened. Yet slowly, imperceptibly, the glaciers began to retreat. The warmth of the sun, patient and distant, began to tip the balance once more. Rivers broke free from their icy shells, carving new paths through the land. The tundra bloomed with short-lived flowers, flashes of color against the pale earth. The birth of ice had reshaped the face of the planet. It carved valleys that still hold rivers today, left behind lakes where glaciers once rested, and scattered stones across continents as silent markers of its passing. It was a force of destruction, yet also of renewal. Beneath its weight, life had learned endurance, memory, and cooperation. The earth had known fire before. Now it knew cold. And in surviving both, life itself had grown wiser. As the ice sheets shimmered beneath the dim sun, they held within them the reflection of every creature that had endured, proof that even in silence and frost, the story of life would continue to move forward, one quiet step at a time. The age of ice had given the earth new shapes and boundaries. Glaciers carved mountains and widened valleys, and when they finally retreated, they left behind a world both fragile and fierce. Grasslands stretched across continents, forests grew thick again where the air softened, and rivers wound through fresh soil, still rich from the grind of the ice. It was a world newly balanced between survival and rebirth, and into this vast, open world stepped the giants. They were not the thunder lizards of the past, but mammals, creatures born from warmth, memory, and adaptation. The age of the great reptiles had ended long ago, yet life, with its endless creativity, had returned to size once more. Evolution seemed to remember what it was like to fill the horizon. Across the plains of the Americas, the ground trembled under the weight of Megatherium, the giant ground sloth. It stood taller than an elephant and weighed as much as a small herd of bison. Yet despite its enormity, it was gentle, a slow browser that reached high into the trees to strip leaves with claws longer than a human arm. When it walked, its massive bulk swayed with quiet rhythm, and when it reared up on hind legs, it could look a predator in the eye. It was a titan of stillness, a monument of endurance. In the colder forests of Europe and Asia, another kind of power stirred. The cave bear roamed the highlands and valleys, broad-shouldered and thick-furred, a creature built for both might and solitude. It could stand over 3 meters tall, its paws leaving deep impressions in the mud that would one day harden into fossils. To survive the cold, it stored fat through the short summers, retreating into caves to sleep through the hardest months of winter. Its dens would one day hold traces of both beast and man, claw marks beside human carvings, the shared imprint of two thinking survivors. and following the herds across the wide, frozen plains came the dire wolves. Heavier than modern wolves, their jaws were stronger, their teeth thick with purpose. They hunted not in isolation, but in unity. Together, they brought down prey many times their size, mammoths, giant bison, and the enormous sloths that wandered too far from cover. Their communication was a song of instinct, their eyes reflections of a world where every movement could mean life or loss. The earth, for all its cold, had never felt so alive. Every corner of the planet held its own version of the colossal and the strange. In South America, Dodicurus, a relative of the armadillo, moved through the grasslands under a dome of armor, its tail tipped with a bony club the size of a sledgehammer. In Australia, marsupial lions prowled the eucalyptus forests, their claws retractable like a cat's, but their bones built for crushing. In the north, shaggy mammoths still marched beneath skies filled with snow, their tusks curling upward like crescents of ancient ivory. To live in this time was to exist in a theater of constant tension. Herbivores towered above the plains, their great bodies slow but unstoppable. Predators watched from the edges, waiting for a single misstep. The cold thinned the weak, the hunger sharpened the strong. Each season rewrote the balance of power, and each life fed the cycle of the next. Yet despite the ferocity of their world, these creatures carried traces of tenderness. The young followed their mothers through the snow, herds protected their calves, circling them when danger came. Wolves shared their kills, bears guarded their cubs, mammoths mourned their dead. Beneath the brutality of survival, there was structure, care, even memory, the quiet heartbeat of connection that had followed mammals through every age. Fossils tell this story in fragments, tooth marks on bone, footprints pressed into ancient clay, skeletons found entangled in struggle, a mammoth's ribcage pierced by the teeth of a lion, the skull of a sloth locked in the grasp of a saber-toothed predator. Each fossil is a frame from a silent film, each layer of earth a forgotten page. Together, they speak of a world that was not peaceful, but profoundly alive, and still the planet changed. The glaciers advanced and retreated in rhythm with time. Valleys flooded, then froze again. The air thickened and thinned, shifting with the slow breath of the earth. The titans adapted, but the rhythm of change began to outpace even them. In their time, these creatures must have seemed eternal, too vast to vanish, too strong to be undone. But evolution is not a story of permanence. It is a story of transition, of one form giving way to another, of life rewriting itself through necessity. For now, though, in the heart of this frozen epoch, the world still belonged to the giants. The herds moved like clouds across the tundra. The predators' howls echoed across valleys of ice and stone. The air was clear and biting, filled with the distant thunder of hooves and the whisper of snow. This was the age of Mammalian. Titans, a brief and brilliant moment when the earth, in all its silence and frost, carried the weight of life once more. Giants walked its plains again, not as echoes of the dinosaurs, but as their own creation, born from warmth and struggle, carrying forward the same ancient truth, that life, no matter how many times it is tested, will always find a way to rise. The ice still lingered over parts of the earth, holding mountains and valleys in its pale grasp. But between the glaciers, life moved in patterns of tension and grace. Herds of mammoths and bison roamed the open plains, and among them, predators watched, silent and deliberate. In that long balance between stillness and motion, one of the most extraordinary hunters ever to walk the land began to take its place. Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat. To see one in life would have been to glimpse both beauty and danger in a single form. It was not a cat of speed, like the cheetahs that would one day sprint across savannas. Nor did it hunt in the same quiet patience as modern lions. Smilodon was built for power, broad-shouldered, deep-chested, and compact, with muscles that rippled under its golden fur. Its neck was thick and sturdy, shaped to anchor the long blades that curved from its mouth like polished ivory knives. Those teeth, elegant and terrible, were both its gift and its burden. Each fang could reach 20 centimeters in length, thin and sharp as the edge of a dagger. But they were also fragile. They could not crush bone or tear through hides in the way that ordinary cat teeth could. Instead, Smilodon had learned precision. When it hunted, it did not chase. It waited. Hidden in tall grasses or crouched in shadow, it let the herd pass until a single target strayed too close, a young bison, a mammoth calf, or a weakened horse. Then, in a burst of motion, it leapt. Its limbs struck with immense force, bringing the prey down in seconds. And once its victim was pinned, the saber-teeth found their purpose. They were not made for tearing, but for slicing. Using its muscular forelimbs to hold the prey still, Smilodon drove its jaws downward into the soft places of the throat or belly, severing arteries with surgical accuracy. The attack was swift, decisive, and silent. A single strike, and the life beneath it was gone. In this, Smilodon was both an artist and an executioner, shaped perfectly for a kind of hunting that no other creature had mastered. Fossils show how specialized it was, jaws that could open almost twice as wide as those of modern cats, but with a bite force surprisingly gentle. Strength had been traded for control. Evolution had sculpted a creature that did not need brute force to kill, only precision. Yet those elegant fangs came with a price. Many skulls unearthed by paleontologists bear the marks of broken teeth or healed fractures. The saber-teeth, though deadly in use, could snap if they struck bone or were caught at the wrong angle. A single mistake in a hunt could mean starvation. The balance between success and ruin was razor thin, and the dangers did not only come from the hunt. Fossil evidence tells a quieter story, one written in scars. Many Smilodon skeletons show fractures and puncture wounds that match their own teeth, not the marks of prey. These were injuries made by rivals. Life among the saber-toothed cats was not gentle. They lived in a world where competition for food was constant, where territories overlapped, and where strength was tested not only against other species but against their own kind. When two males met, they clashed not to kill, but to claim. Their fangs, though deadly, were also displays of beauty and status, gleaming in the light as warnings as much as weapons. A battle between them must have been a thing of power and ceremony. Two giants circling, muscles tense, air heavy with their scent. Their growls rolled across the plains like thunder, deep and resonant. When they finally struck, it was brief and brutal, paws colliding, jaws snapping, blood darkening the ground. Many bore the marks of these duels for the rest of their lives, reminders of the fragile line between dominance and death. And yet, for all their savagery, there was something graceful about them. The saber-tooth was not chaos made flesh, but a careful design, balanced between strength and restraint. Even their skeletons tell of elegance, curved bones shaped by both power and poise. In life, they were creatures of paradox, built to kill, yet easily broken, made for violence, yet crafted with the symmetry of art. When one imagines them walking through the long grass, the image is hauntingly quiet. The world around them was cold but not lifeless. Herds grazed, the wind carried the smell of snow, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a pack of dire wolves howled beneath the moon. The saber-tooth stood alone in the dim light, its breath rising in slow clouds, its eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Today, their bones rest beneath layers of tar and earth, preserved in silence. The famous tar pits of Los Angeles, thick with fossils, hold hundreds of them, victims of traps laid by time. Some were drawn in by the cries of struggling prey, others by instinct, their strength betrayed by the same cunning that once defined them. But even in death, they remain magnificent. The smooth curve of their selfing fangs still gleams beneath museum lights, a reminder of a world that mixed beauty and brutality in equal measure. In the long story of life, Smilodon and its kin were brief, but unforgettable. They were the embodiment of precision, of danger refined into elegance. And though their age passed with the last great ice, the shape of their legacy still lingers, in every silent predator that waits, in every shadow that moves with patience, and in every reminder that nature's most extraordinary designs are often its most fleeting. The rise of the saber-tooth was not just a chapter of power, but of artistry, a moment when evolution, for a time, carved perfection out of peril and let it walk the earth. The world was still a land of giants. Across the open plains, mammoths grazed in herds, their shadows long beneath the fading light. Saber-toothed cats slept among the tall grasses, their flanks rising and falling with the slow rhythm of breath. Wolves prowled along riverbanks, watching for weakness, for opportunity. It was a world shaped by strength and endurance, a world where survival belonged to those who could fight or flee. And yet, in the quiet corners of this restless earth, a different kind of power was beginning to stir. It did not roar or stamp its feet. It did not shine with claws or teeth. It flickered behind eyes, small, bright, and searching. It hid in the gestures of hands, in the shared glances between kin, in the faint murmur of sound that meant something more than instinct. Here, among the branches and the forests, the primates were changing. For millions of years, they had watched the world from the safety of the trees, their lives measured by leaps, climbs, and calls. But now the forests were thinning, replaced by open spaces of sun and shadow. To survive here required something new, not sharper claws or thicker fur, but thought. Their bodies began to shift. Some learned to walk more upright, freeing their hands for new possibilities. Fingers that once clung to bark now grasped stones, roots, and bones. Eyes grew keener, able to judge distance and motion with greater precision. But it was what happened inside the skull that truly changed everything. Their brains began to grow. At first, the difference was small, a few extra folds, a little more space for memory and imagination. But those small changes carried immense weight. With them came awareness, problem solving, and perhaps something resembling wonder. They could remember where the ripest fruits grew, recall the sound of danger, and even anticipate what tomorrow might bring. Soon, they began to work together in ways no other creature had. A single primate was fragile, but a group could become something stronger, a network of shared minds. One could watch for predators, while another searched for food. A mother could teach her offspring not just what to eat, but how to find it. Through cooperation, they built invisible threads of trust that stretched across generations. Their communication deepened. What began as cries of alarm or calls of comfort evolved into a more complex language of tone and gesture. A tilt of the head, a flick of the hand, the rhythm of a sound, all carried meaning. They could warn, invite, console. Slowly, the world around them began to fill not just with noise, but with conversation, and through these exchanges, something even more extraordinary began to form. Memory shared between minds. No longer was knowledge lost when one life ended. It passed onward, taught, imitated, improved. Over time, this inheritance became more powerful than claws or fangs. It allowed one generation to build upon the wisdom of the last. The primates began to use tools. At first, they were simple, a stick for reaching, a rock for breaking open nuts or bones. But each tool carried an idea, and each idea was a step toward mastery. The forest became a workshop, the savanna a classroom. Their world expanded as their curiosity did. They learned to adapt not only through their bodies, but through their minds. Cooperation became a way of life. They groomed one another to build trust, shared food to strengthen bonds, and watched the skies together as the seasons shifted. Their survival no longer depended only on the land, but on each other. Within this shared life, emotion deepened too. They began to comfort the injured, protect the weak, and mourn the dead. In their eyes, one could glimpse not only awareness, but care, a tenderness that no other species had carried so far. In time, these early minds began to dream beyond the moment. They played, they experimented, they imagined a broken branch could become a lever, a stone could become a weapon, a reflection in water could inspire recognition, the faint spark of self-awareness. The earth had seen intelligence before in many forms, in dolphins navigating the deep, in elephants remembering their dead, in crows solving puzzles of flight and hunger. But this was different. Here was a kind of mind that built upon itself, that learned to question not only the world, but its own place within it. It was a quiet revolution, unnoticed by the titans that still walked the land. The mammoths continued their migrations. The saber-toothed cats hunted as they always had, and the great sloths moved slowly through the trees. None could have known that the balance of power was shifting beneath their feet, for in these small primates, in their hands, their tools, their memories, and their growing language, the seed of something vast had been planted. It was not yet humanity, not yet civilization. It was only potential, fragile, flickering, but unstoppable, a spark that would one day ignite thought into art, survival into story, and memory into meaning. For now, it remained simple. A mother teaching her child to crack a nut, a group sharing warmth beneath the fading light, a pair of eyes looking at the stars, not just seeing, but wondering. In a world still ruled by beasts of strength, intelligence was learning to stand, and quietly, patiently, it began to shape the earth in ways no claw or tooth ever could. The world was still cold when the first humans began to walk across it. Ice covered the far reaches of the continents, gleaming like glass beneath the pale sun. Between the glaciers stretched plains of wind-swept grass, frozen rivers, and endless silence. It was into this quiet and dangerous world that humanity took its first steps. They were not yet many, small bands of travelers, families bound by firelight and shared memory. They moved through a landscape that still belonged to giants. Mammoths grazed on the tundra, their breath rising in white plumes that hung in the still air. Woolly rhinos scraped the snow with their horns, uncovering brittle stems of grass. Cave bears slept through the long winters, and great cats still prowled the shadows, their golden eyes glinting in the dim light. To walk among such creatures was to live between awe and fear. The humans were smaller, fragile by comparison. Their skin had no fur to guard against the cold, and their hands, though clever, were soft. Yet those same hands carried fire, and with it, imagination. They carried tools shaped from stone and bone, sharpened by thought rather than tooth. And they carried something else, a kind of vision that no other creature possessed. They did not see the giants only as rivals or prey. They saw them as symbols, as spirits, as companions in the long story of survival. In deep caves across Europe, those visions remain. By the flickering light of torches, humans painted the walls with shapes of the world they knew. Herds of mammoths, bison with lowered heads, horses mid-gallop, and lions stalking through the dark. The animals were drawn with grace and movement, their bodies alive with color and rhythm. Some were painted over one another, as if layered through time, a record of memory rather than a single moment. These paintings were not mere decoration, they were conversations with the world. The caves echoed with the sound of breath, with the drip of water, with whispers that may have been prayers. The artists were not simply describing life, but honoring it, capturing the mystery of the beings that shared their earth. Each stroke of ochre and charcoal was a gesture of reverence, and perhaps also of fear. To hunt such giants required more than courage, it required unity. When the time came to bring one down, humans did not act alone. They gathered in groups, moving with quiet coordination and trust. They learned to read the landscape, to understand the winds and the habits of the beasts. They tracked mammoths across frozen plains, waiting for the moment when the herd faltered or one animal grew weak. Their weapons were simple but clever, spears tipped with sharpened stone, sometimes hardened by fire. They used pits and cliffs to their advantage, guiding the great creatures toward danger through shouts and movement. It was a perilous balance. One wrong step, and the hunter could become the hunted. But when they succeeded, it was not just victory, it was survival. The kill fed entire groups, not only with meat, but with warmth and tools. Bones became shelters, tusks became weapons, hides became clothing. Nothing was wasted. The mammoth was both a meal and a monument, a source of life in a world that offered little. And yet, even after the hunt, respect remained. Many bones found by archaeologists seem deliberately arranged, as though laid to rest rather than discarded. Skulls were placed upright, tusks curved in careful arcs. These gestures speak of gratitude or perhaps apology, a quiet acknowledgement of balance between life and death. The humans knew that the giants gave as much as they took. Around their fires, stories were told. They spoke of mammoths that carried the spirits of the ancestors, of cave lions that guarded the edge of the night, of herds that thundered like distant storms. In these stories, the line between human and animal blurred. The giants were not merely part of the landscape, they were woven into the rhythm of existence. Over generations, the partnership of fear and dependence shaped humanity itself. Hunting taught strategy, danger taught cooperation, memory taught teaching, the passing of knowledge from one mind to another. Each generation grew wiser, not because they were stronger, but because they remembered. Slowly, their tools became more refined. Spears gained stone blades set in wooden shafts. Fires burned longer, controlled and carried across distances. Words, still simple, became a way to plan, to teach, to dream. And all the while, the giants remained near, massive, patient, and watchful. For a time, the earth held both in harmony, the hunter and the hunted, the artist and the animal, each shaping the other's fate. Even now, tens of thousands of years later, their presence lingers. The paintings still breathe in the caves of Lascaux and Altamira, untouched by centuries of dust. The bones of mammoths lie buried in frost, their tusks still gleaming faintly as if remembering firelight. Those first meetings between humans and the giants were not just moments in history. They were the beginning of understanding, the recognition that life, in all its forms, was part of a single story. A story written not only in blood and survival, but in wonder, in respect, and in the shared breath of creatures beneath the same cold sky. In that frozen world, humanity was still young, its voice quiet, its tools humble, but in its eyes, something eternal had already awakened, the awareness that to live is to learn, to imagine, and to remember. The world began to soften. After hundreds of thousands of years locked in cold silence, the Ice Age loosened its hold. Glaciers that had once carved mountains and valleys began to retreat. The winds grew gentler, the air more humid. Rivers swelled with meltwater, and flowers returned to plains that had known only snow. For the first time in ages, warmth touched the earth again. It was a quiet transformation at first, a long thaw that crept across continents. The ice melted inch by inch, day by day, releasing the land it had held prisoner. Forests crept northward, reclaiming soil long buried under frost. Grasslands spread across the open plains. The world began to breathe again, but with the warmth came imbalance. The great beasts that had once ruled the cold were creatures of precision. They had adapted to the rhythm of ice and wind, to the scarcity and struggle of glacial life. Their bodies were built for endurance, for conserving heat and surviving hunger. Yet now, the rhythm changed too quickly. What had taken millennia to freeze began to melt in centuries. Mammoths, mastodons, and giant sloths felt the shift first. The grass that had sustained them was replaced by forests too dense to graze. Wetlands turned to mud, and water pooled where ice once lay firm. Food sources moved or vanished altogether. Some species wandered, following the old patterns of migration that no longer led to life. Others stayed behind, trapped between memory and change. The air grew heavier with moisture and warmth. New plants thrived, but not the ones the giants depended on. Insects multiplied. Diseases, once frozen into silence, stirred again in the thaw. And alongside these slow forces of nature, another kind of change walked the land, one that thought, planned, and remembered. Humans had spread far beyond their ancient caves. They had crossed frozen bridges of land, followed rivers and coastlines, and learned to live in nearly every corner of the earth. Their tools had evolved. With them, spears tipped with carved stone, darts launched by atlatls, fire hardened and guided with purpose. The hunt that had once been desperate became organized, even strategic. The herds were large, but not endless. Every kill mattered, every migration path could be blocked, every frightened stampede could mean the death of a dozen animals instead of one. And so, the balance that had lasted through countless ages began to tilt. It was not a single cause, not a single moment. It was a quiet unraveling, woven from many threads. The climate warmed too quickly. The seasons grew unstable. Snow fell in strange months and melted before it could stay. The plants changed, and the animals changed with them, except the great ones, who could not. Some starved. Some failed to reproduce. Some simply vanished from the record without leaving a trace of why. Others fell to hunters. In ancient river valleys, bones show the marks of sharp tools and fire. Mammoth tusks carved into tools and ornaments. Sloths stripped for meat. Bison driven into narrow canyons where there was no escape. Each act was survival, not cruelty. Yet in the span of only a few thousand years, the balance tipped too far. From the cold steppes of Siberia to the vast plains of North America, the great herds began to disappear. The mammoths that had roamed in tens of thousands dwindled to hundreds. In Australia, giant marsupials fell silent. In South America, the towering ground sloths and armored glyptodonts were gone. On every continent except Africa, where the beasts had evolved alongside humans and learned to read their danger, the giants fell. Some scientists would later call it overkill. Others would speak of disease, of warming, of coincidence. But perhaps it was not one reason, but all of them together, the tangled threads of nature and humanity pulling at each other until the fabric tore. The last mammoths survived longer than the rest. On a small island north of Siberia, cut off by rising seas, a few hundred held on. They shrank in size over generations, becoming dwarfs of their ancestors, their tusks curling tighter as food grew scarce. For thousands of years after the mainland herds were gone, they lived there in isolation, until the wind and hunger took them too. And then the earth grew quiet again. The tundras that once shook with the footsteps of herds fell still. The forests echoed only with the calls of smaller creatures. The giants that had watched over the world for millions of years, the mastodons, the great cats, the bears, the enormous sloths, had vanished, leaving only fossils and stories behind. Humans remained. They carried the memory of the lost beasts in carvings, paintings, and myths. The mammoth became the god of winter, the aurochs a spirit of strength, the cave bear a creature of reverence and warning. In every story told around the fire, there lingered a shadow of what once was. The world that emerged from the Ice Age was still beautiful, still alive, but smaller somehow. The thunder of the old herds was gone, replaced by the quiet rhythm of humankind's rise. And beneath the soil, deep in frozen layers of earth, the bones of the giants waited, preserved in silence, as if the planet itself remembered them. The last breath of the mammoth age had passed. The earth had turned a page, gentle but final, and the age of monsters had given way to the age of memory. The ice had withdrawn. It did not vanish in a single season or century, but in a long, sighing retreat. Glaciers melted back toward the poles, their meltwater carving new rivers, shaping lakes, and feeding the veins of a planet waking from its frozen sleep. Valleys once crushed beneath walls of ice opened again to the sun. The earth, quiet and bruised from the weight of an age, began to breathe freely. Where once there had been endless tundra and wind, green began to return. Moss crept across the stones first, small and defiant, holding fast to soil that barely existed. Then came the grasses, slender and whispering, spreading across the open plains that had once echoed with the steps of mammoths. Birch and pine followed, their roots digging deep into the loosened ground. In time, forests rose like slow waves across continents, reclaiming what the ice had left bare. The air grew softer, rain fell more often, washing away the dust of centuries. The sky that had once reflected cold, silver now shimmered with warmth, filled with the hum of new life. But beneath this renewal lay a strange and gentle quiet. The world had changed, and the great voices that once filled it were gone. The trumpeting of mammoths no longer rolled across the plains. The low bellows of aurochs and the deep growls of saber-toothed cats were gone from the night. The earth still lived, but its tone had shifted. Where once power ruled, now subtlety did. The giants had left behind their bones, scattered across continents, locked in peat bogs and frozen soil. They were the last monuments of a time when life reached for enormous scales, testing the limits of size and endurance. Now, their smaller cousins walked in their place. Tiny elephants roamed the islands of the Mediterranean, no taller than a human. Shaggy oxen grazed where mammoths once fed. The descendants of massive bears and wolves lived on, smaller but clever, adapted to the new rhythm of the Holocene. It was as if nature had chosen restraint over spectacle, trading grandeur for balance. The new world was quieter, but also steadier. Seasons found their rhythm again. The warmth of summer returned predictably, and the snows of winter came and went in measured cycles. Rivers settled into their courses, carving fertile valleys where forests could flourish. Birds returned to the skies in multitudes, their calls weaving a new kind of music through the canopy. In this stable world, smaller creatures thrived. Deer moved like shadows through the trees. Foxes hunted mice in the underbrush. Frogs sang from the edges of ponds that had been shaped by retreating glaciers. The balance of life, long disrupted by ice and extinction, began to mend itself slowly. Humans, too, changed with the land. The great hunts of the mammoth age faded into memory. With the giants gone, survival no longer depended on chasing titans across endless plains. Instead, People turned inward, to the soil, to rivers, to the rhythm of growing things. They began to sow seeds, to stay in one place long enough to see the seasons turn. Villages appeared where camps once stood. The age of constant motion gave way to an age of patience. The world's silence after the giants was not emptiness, but space, space for something new to take root. Still, traces of what had come before lingered. The ground itself remembered. Fossilized footprints lay preserved in hardened mud, silent reminders of herds that had passed long ago. Great tusks surfaced from melting permafrost, curved and pale, like the memory of a lost moon. And in the human imagination, the giants never truly disappeared. They became stories, spirits of ice and shadow, beasts that once ruled a younger, wilder earth. Around firelight, their shapes were reborn in myth. The mammoth became the guardian of winter, the great sloth became the mountain that moved, the saber-tooth became the unseen presence in the dark, patient and eternal. The Holocene world grew outward and upward, filling with color and life, but always carrying the echo of what was gone. Forests covered the glacial plains, their roots threading through the bones of the ancient. Rivers that once carried ice now flowed clear and steady toward the sea. The animals that remained learned to live lightly, to adapt quickly, to share the earth rather than dominate it. It was a quieter earth, yes, but not an empty one. The stillness carried meaning, like the pause after a long song. In that silence, evolution was still at work, shaping the next story, the next design, the next rise of life. From the soil enriched by extinction, flowers bloomed. From the bones of the giants came nutrients for trees that would shade the future. And in the space left behind by what had fallen, new creatures, smaller, swifter, and more adaptable, began their own experiments in survival. Life, as always, found a way forward. And though the last echoes of the age of monsters faded into the distance, their memory remained written in every living thing that followed, in the endurance of elephants, in the intelligence of humans, in the quiet persistence of life itself. The giants had gone, but the earth had not forgotten them. It carried their story in its rivers, its stones, its forests, and in the calm breath of this new age, the world continued to turn, gentler, smaller, but still alive, still beautiful, still dreaming of what comes next. The world had quieted, but its memory was not erased. Beneath the soft hum of forests, beneath the calm rhythm of rivers, something older lingered, not in the air or the soil, but in us. Every heartbeat carries a whisper of that age of struggle, when the world was ruled by ice, hunger, and giants. We may live now in comfort, surrounded by the warmth of civilization, but our bodies and instincts were forged in a colder world. Every muscle, every reflex, every flicker of fear or burst of courage is a gift, or perhaps a scar, from that long and violent chapter of Earth's story. When humans first emerged into the Ice Age, they were not masters of anything. They were small, slow, and fragile among beasts that could crush or outrun them with ease. Yet survival favored not the strongest, but the most adaptable, and so, piece by piece, our ancestors were shaped by the challenges that the monsters left behind. The first of those inheritances was endurance. Long before strength came stamina. Humans could not overpower the great beasts, but they could outlast them. Their bodies became engines of persistence, built not for speed, but for distance. Unlike most animals, we could sweat to cool ourselves, allowing us to keep moving under the sun when others faltered. Our legs grew long, our joints steady, our lungs vast for their size. In those days, to live was to follow the rhythm of movement, to walk for hours, for days, across the open plains. The hunt was not a sudden chase, but a test of patience. A wounded animal could be tracked until exhaustion claimed it. Every step became an act of survival, every breath a bridge between hunger and life. That rhythm remains in us still, in the quiet satisfaction of walking far, of climbing higher than we must, of pushing through when we could have stopped. The second inheritance was fear. It may not sound like a gift, but it was. Fear was the teacher, the invisible guardian that kept our kind alive when the night was not safe. It sharpened our senses, kept our hands close to the fire, our eyes fixed on the shadows. The memory of being hunted carved itself deep into the nervous system. Even today, when the wilderness no longer howls with predators, our bodies still remember a sudden sound in the dark, the prickling of the skin when we are watched, the instinct to look over our shoulder. These are echoes of nights spent beneath uncertain skies. Fear was not weakness then, it was wisdom. It taught us caution, silence, and awareness of the world beyond our immediate sight. Yet humans did not survive on endurance and fear alone. Something gentler, something rarer was needed too. Cooperation. No other creature relied so completely on the minds beside it. To face a world filled with mammoths and saber-toothed cats, unity was not optional. It was the only path forward. One human alone could do little, but together they could build traps, plan ambushes, share food, and carry stories from one generation to the next. Our ancestors learned to trust, to divide labor, to teach their young not only by instinct, but by memory. The same cooperation that brought down mammoths also built the first shelters and sparked the first fires, and in that unity, language was born. Through it, humans found a new kind of strength, one not measured by muscle, but by meaning. Words became tools, allowing a hunter to warn of danger, a mother to comfort her child, a tribe to remember the path of the herds. The monsters had forced humanity into intelligence, into empathy, into community. They were, unknowingly, the architects of our minds. The Ice Age tested the body, but it also shaped the spirit. To survive in such a world, our ancestors needed imagination. They had to see not just what was, but what could be, to picture a weapon before it existed, to sense danger before it appeared, to hope before dawn when the night seemed endless. Even our biology carries traces of that imagination, the adrenaline that quickens our pulse when we face danger, the rush that pushes us to run, to fight, to protect. It is the echo of instincts that once decided life or death. And yet, within that same chemistry lies something else, the drive to connect, to love, to protect one another, even when it is not required. The same nervous system that once trembled in fear now stirs in compassion. The same eyes that watched for predators now seek faces, emotions, and meaning. We are not separate from the age of monsters. We are its survivors, its inheritors. The fire that once kept the dark at bay still burns behind our ribs. The patience that once followed herds across frozen plains still guides us when life becomes difficult. The courage that faced down creatures 10 times our size still rises quietly when we are afraid. Every heartbeat, every breath, every dream is part of that lineage. When we lift our heads to the cold wind, when our hearts race for no reason, when we find comfort in the closeness of others, we are remembering, not consciously, but deeply, what it meant to live in a world larger and harsher than our own. The monsters are gone, their bones buried beneath forests and frost. But the lessons they taught remain alive in us. We carry their legacy in our blood, in our endurance, in our shared warmth. And though the world is quieter now, it still hums with that ancient memory, the faint, unbroken rhythm of life learning to endure, to fear, to care, and to rise again. The world seems calm now. Forests ripple softly in the wind, oceans stretch in steady blue lines. The skies no longer darken with ash or flame, and yet Beneath this illusion of peace, Earth still stirs with the same restless heart it has always carried. The giants have vanished, but the planet has not stopped changing. The warmth that once melted glaciers still flickers in the atmosphere. The cold that carved valleys still lingers deep beneath the poles. Every drop of rain, every tremor of the ground, every shifting season is a quiet reminder that calm is only a pause between movements. When humans began to rise, the world had already entered the Holocene, a brief moment of stability after so many ages of fire, ice, and extinction. The climate softened, the seasons steadied, and for the first time in a long while, the earth offered predictability. It was this rare gentleness that allowed civilization to bloom. People built homes beside rivers that no longer froze each year. They learned when the rains would come, when the floods would fade, when the soil was ready to feed them again. Villages grew into cities, cities into empires, and for a while, it felt as though the chaos had finally quieted. But the earth never promised peace, it only promised motion. The calm of the Holocene was not a permanent state, but a breath, a small space in the long inhale and exhale of geological time. Beneath the surface, continents continued to drift, volcanoes still murmured, ice still grew and melted in its slow rhythm, and the air above, though tranquil for a time, was already gathering new storms. Over thousands of years, humans multiplied. They filled the forests and plains once ruled by the megafauna. They crossed oceans, built ships, burned forests, and reshaped rivers. In doing so, they became the planet's newest force of change, an echo of the ancient cataclysms, but driven not by fire or stone, but by thought. The warmth of hearth fires spread into fields of wheat. The sparks of industry grew into cities whose smoke brushed the sky. Metal and coal pulled from the earth, released gases once locked in stone, and the thin balance of air began to shift again. At first, it was invisible. The seasons blurred slightly, winters shorter, summers longer. Glaciers that had survived since the Ice Age began to retreat once more. Coral reefs, those delicate cities of the sea, paled and crumbled as oceans warmed and turned to acid. The same ancient cycle returned, the one that had long shaped the planet: change, adaptation, survival. It would be comforting to think of this as something new, something separate from the story of deep time, but the truth is gentler and stranger. The line between past and present has never been as solid as we imagine. The world that humans stand on now is the same stage upon which every age of turmoil has played. The air we breathe was forged by the same volcanoes that once darkened the skies of the Eocene. The waters we drink once flowed beneath glaciers that shaped the mammoth's path. The soil beneath our feet carries atoms recycled from countless creatures, from ferns and ammonites to ancient whales. The past is not buried. It circulates quietly through everything alive, and yet the rhythm of the planet feels faster now. The balance that once shifted over millennia now trembles within centuries. Forests vanish in the span of a single human lifetime. The ice that took 10,000 years to form melts in less than 100. Still, life adjusts, as it always has. Some animals move to higher ground, others migrate north with the changing air. Even in the heart of cities, where glass and light replace the wilderness, plants bloom in cracks of concrete, birds nest in the rafters of forgotten buildings, and insects hum beneath the glow of streetlights. The resilience that shaped the first mammals still threads through the world, quiet but unbroken. It endures in every seed that finds a way to root, in every tide pool that shelters new life, in every breath that passes from forest to lung. Humans, too, carry that same instinct, the ancient drive to adapt, to endure. Beneath all our complexity lies the simple pulse of survival that has guided life through every collapse and rebirth. We feel it when we rebuild after disaster, when we plant trees in damaged soil, when we pause to listen to the wind and sense that the planet beneath us is alive. The calm of our age is not peace in the true sense. It is an interval, the brief stillness between storms. But within that stillness lies possibility. Every action, every choice ripples outward into the future, shaping the next chapter of Earth's long and patient story. The climate will shift again, the forests will move, the oceans will rise and fall as they always have, life will change with them, and perhaps so will we. For now, the world spins quietly under a fragile veil of balance. The mountains stand, the rivers flow, the air hums softly with warmth. To most, it feels calm, but beneath that calm, the deep machinery of Earth continues its slow, unstoppable rhythm. It is the same pulse that drove the tides when the first creatures crawled from the sea, the same pulse that endured the fire of the asteroid and the ice that followed, the same pulse that now beats in us. The age we live in feels peaceful, but it is only another turning in a long, unbroken cycle. The earth still dreams, still moves, still changes, and though we call this the age of calm, it is, as it has always been, the age of motion, the living heartbeat of a planet that never truly rests. The dinosaurs died in a day. A single strike from the sky ended a kingdom that had lasted 160 million years. Yet what came after did not bring silence. It brought trial and patience and the long struggle of life, learning how to exist again on a wounded world. The earth that rose from the ashes of that impact was not calm. It was restless, unpredictable, and beautiful in its instability. Fire and flood, heat and cold, destruction and renewal, the planet turned through all of them like a slow, eternal wheel. In the beginning, the survivors were small. They crept through the ruins of forests that no longer stood, burrowed into the ground, or clung to the edges of rivers thick with ash. But in those fragile lives, something remarkable began. Evolution, quiet and tireless, started to rebuild. It shaped new forms from the remnants of the old, testing what could survive in a world that refused to stay still. The ages that followed were not gentle. They saw the rise of volcanoes that burned for centuries, the surge of oceans that boiled and froze, and climates that swung between extremes. Yet each trial pushed life forward. Every collapse forced a new beginning. In those millions of years after the dinosaurs, the world became a laboratory of change. Mammals grew bold, birds reclaimed the air, and reptiles adapted in ways that defied extinction. The earth became a theater of strange experiments, creatures with horns and hooves, with trunks and sails, with teeth shaped for crushing bone or slicing fruit. The balance of life shifted again and again, sculpted by time's endless patience. And within that story, the outlines of our own world began to form. The continents found their places, mountains rose and eroded, seas opened and closed, climates softened and hardened in turn. What was once a landscape of giants became one of balance, of forests, plains, deserts, and oceans woven together by rhythm and chance. Every breath of air we take still carries the memory of those transformations. The oxygen in our lungs has drifted through the leaves of ancient jungles and across the lungs of creatures long turned to stone. Every mountain holds the imprint of pressure and heat from ages when continents collided. Even the soil beneath our feet was ground and remade by the glaciers of forgotten winters. The monsters of the past are gone, yet they remain everywhere. Their bones lie beneath the fields we farm. Their shapes echo in the animals that still walk the earth. Birds carry the song of dinosaurs in their throats. Elephants remember the silence of mammoths in their long, slow hearts. Whales sing in tones shaped by ancestors who once walked on land, and humans, fragile, clever, and curious, carry the deepest memory of all. We are children of survivors, born from a lineage that learned to endure the darkness after the fire. The same instincts that once kept our ancestors alive among predators now guide us through the challenges of our own age. The endurance, the caution, the need to belong, they are all threads spun from that ancient tapestry. When we look at a storm, we see a glimpse of the chaos that built us. When we feel the pull of the sea, we are remembering the world that once covered everything, even our wonder, the quiet awe that draws us to fossils, to mountains, to the night sky, is a kind of inheritance. It is the echo of a truth older than memory, that everything changes, and yet everything continues. The age after the dinosaurs was never peaceful. It was a crucible where life was tested, shattered, and remade countless times. It was the proving ground of evolution itself, not a story of destruction, but of transformation. From those ages of struggle came diversity, intelligence, and resilience beyond measure. The forests that now sway in the wind are the descendants of those that burned. The creatures that roam the world today are born from survivors who learn to adapt in the face of impossible odds. Even the quiet moments of rest, the stillness of a forest at dusk, the calm ripple of a tide, exist because of that long struggle. In a way, the earth itself learned how to breathe again. Every grain of sand, every gust of wind, every drop of water carries the record of what it endured. It remembers the comet, the fire, the freezing oceans, and the endless rebirths that followed. The story of life is not a tale of one era replacing another, but of an unbroken chain of persistence, adaptation, and renewal. And somewhere within that long chain, within the bones and blood of every living thing, the memory of the monsters endures, not as fear, but as foundation, not as destruction, but as proof that life is stronger than catastrophe. The earth is quieter now, but never still. The same cycles that shaped the age of beasts continue, unseen yet eternal. Seasons turn, continents drift, the air warms and cools, and life, patient as always, moves with them. Perhaps that is the final lesson of those ancient ages, that even in the deepest chaos, there is continuity. The same fire that once ended worlds also forged the beginnings of new ones. And somehow, through all of it, life found a way to rest.